Before the electric light, before the combustion engine, before Silicon Valley dreamers ever typed a single line of code, there was steam. Hissing, roaring, unstoppable steam. It didn't just power machines, it rewired human civilization. Tonight we travel back to the age of iron and fire, when America's midnight mills never slept. And neither did the men and women who fed them. If you're new here, welcome. History for Sleep is your place to drift off to the stories that shaped the world. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Now, let's let history carry you to sleep. Long before the first plume of steam curled above a factory chimney, before iron pistons drove their rhythmic thunder through the floors of American mills, there was water, cold, clear, endlessly patient water tumbling down from the Appalachian highlands towards the sea. It asked for nothing. It never tired. And for the earliest Americans who understood how to work with it rather than against it, it gave everything. The story of American industry does not begin with invention. It begins with geography. It begins with the particular shape of a continent, the way its mountains were arranged, the way its rivers fell, because in that falling, in that long, gradual, then sudden drop from highland to coastal plain, lay something that human beings had recognized for centuries before the first colonist ever set foot on American soil: potential energy, stored in moving water, waiting to be borrowed. To understand why American mills rose where they rose, you have to understand the landscape they were born into. The eastern seaboard of North America is divided, geologically speaking, into two very different worlds. Inland, the ancient weathered ridges of the Appalachian Mountains slope gradually downward through a region called the Piedmont, a rolling plateau of red clay and granite. Then, quite abruptly, the land drops. The rivers that have been moving slowly and gently across the Piedmont suddenly encounter a boundary, a geological seam where hard, resistant rock meets the softer sedimentary soils of the coastal plain. At this boundary, rivers cascade. They tumble over ledges and rush through rocky narrows. They churn and roar and throw up mist. This boundary, running roughly parallel to the Atlantic coast from Alabama all the way north to New Jersey and beyond, is called the Fall Line, and the Fall Line is where American industry was born. Every major city along the eastern seaboard that grew into an industrial center in the early years of the Republic sits on or very near this line: Richmond, Virginia; Columbia, South Carolina; Augusta, Georgia; Raleigh, North Carolina; Trenton, New Jersey. These were not arbitrary choices. The people who settled these places, who planted their towns and called their neighbors and began to build, understood instinctively what the sound of rushing water meant. It meant power. It meant work that didn't require human muscle or animal strain. It meant the possibility of doing more, of making more, of becoming more than a subsistence community scratching at the earth. The technology they used to capture this power was ancient. Waterwheels had been turning in Europe and Asia for well over 1,000 years before English settlers arrived in Virginia. The Romans had used them to grind grain. Medieval European monasteries had built sophisticated mill complexes, capable of powering not just millstones, but forge hammers and bellows and fulling stalks for processing wool. The basic principle was elegantly simple: channel moving water so that it strikes a wheel fitted with paddles or buckets, and the force of the water's motion is converted into rotational energy. That rotational energy, carried through wooden shafts and gears, can then be applied to almost any mechanical task a human mind can conceive. In the American colonies, the first application was almost always the same: grinding grain. Grist mills were the indispensable centers of early rural life. A community without a grist mill was a community entirely dependent on hand grinding, an exhausting and time-consuming process that consumed hours every day, and still produced flour that was coarse, unevenly ground, and prone to spoilage. A community with a grist mill had something precious: time. When the mill did the grinding, people could do other things. They could plant more fields, raise more livestock, build better homes, engage in trade. The grist mill didn't just process grain, it created surplus, and surplus, in the long story of human civilization, is the seed from which everything else grows. Colonial millers were consequential figures. They occupied a position in their communities somewhere between craftsman and public servant, because the mill was a shared resource, a place where the entire community brought its harvest and received back something transformed. The relationship between miller and community was intimate and sometimes tense. Millers customarily took a portion of the grain they processed as payment, a practice known as the toll, and disputes over the fairness of that toll were among the most common sources of friction in colonial rural life. A miller who was known to be honest was a miller who was trusted with the community's food supply. That was no small thing. Early American mills were built from wood, almost entirely. The wheel itself, the shaft it turned, the gears that transferred that rotation to the millstones, all of it was timber shaped by hand with axes and adzes and draw knives. The millstones themselves were the exception, heavy discs of carefully selected granite or imported French burrstone, the upper stone turning against the lower, the grain fed between them through a hole at the center and emerging at the edges as flour. The selection and maintenance of millstones was a specialized art. A good millstone cutter could read the grain of the rock the way a surgeon reads tissue, knowing where the stone would hold and where it might fracture under the immense lateral pressure of grinding. The sounds of an operating grist mill were layered and enveloping. The first thing you would have heard, approaching along the mill road, was the water itself, the rush and tumble of the mill race, the channel dug or diverted to control the water's flow to the wheel. Then, closer, the rhythmic creaking of the wheel, the wooden paddles meeting the water in a pattern as steady as breathing. Inside the mill building, above all of that, the millstones sang. It was a low, resonant sound, more felt than heard, a grinding vibration that traveled through the floors and up through the soles of your feet. The air was thick with flour dust, hanging in the light from the small windows like a slow white fog. Mills were dangerous places. Flour dust, suspended densely enough in air, is explosive, a fact that colonial millers learned through tragic experience, though without the chemistry to explain why. As colonial settlements grew and the economy became more complex, the water wheel found new applications. Sawmills appeared alongside grist mills, harnessing the same falling water to power up and down saws that could cut timber far faster than any hand crew. The ability to produce sawn lumber quickly and in quantity transformed construction in early America. Houses became larger and more refined. Churches rose. Wharves were built. The forest, which had always been both resource and obstacle, became something that could be processed at scale. From sawing and grinding, the technology spread further. Fulling mills processed wool cloth, beating it with heavy wooden hammers to mat and thicken the fibers. Forge mills used water power to drive bellows and trip hammers, enabling the production of iron goods that would otherwise have required enormous manual labor. Paper mills harnessed the wheel to drive the stamping equipment that reduced rags to the pulp from which paper was made. Tanning operations used water power to grind bark. Oil mills pressed flaxseed. The water wheel, that ancient and simple device, was becoming a general-purpose engine, available to be adapted to whatever productive need a community could imagine. The geography of the fall line meant that these mills clustered. Where a river dropped steeply, there was often enough energy for multiple mill operations in close proximity, each one occupying a different point along the cascade, each one diverting a portion of the flow through its own carefully constructed race. Visiting one of these mill complexes in the mid-18th century would have been a striking experience, a concentration of mechanical activity and noise unlike almost anything else in the rural American landscape. These were proto-industrial zones, places where the logic of specialization and continuous production was already beginning to assert itself, decades before anyone had thought to apply steam to a piston. The men who built and operated these mills were not, for the most part, formally educated engineers. They were practical mechanics in the original sense of the word, people who understood how things worked through touch and observation, and the accumulated wisdom of a craft tradition, passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice. Their knowledge was embodied rather than theoretical. They knew how to read a river, how to judge its flow across the seasons, how to site a dam to maximize head without creating flooding problems upstream, how to design a mill race that would deliver water to the wheel with minimum loss to leakage or friction. This knowledge was hard-won and carefully guarded. Not all rivers were equal, and not all communities were equally fortunate in their access to falling water. In the flat coastal lowlands, south of the fall line, and in the broad river valleys of the interior, water power was scarce or inconsistent. Communities in these regions relied on wind. The windmills of the Chesapeake and Long Island were not incidental features of the landscape but essential infrastructure. Or, on animal power, the patient circling of horses or oxen turning a sweep that drove a simple mill mechanism. These alternatives worked, but they were slower and less reliable than a good waterfall. They imposed limits. The communities that sat on the fall line had an advantage that was literally built into the earth beneath them. And over the generations, that advantage compounded. By the time the American Revolution came and went, the watermill was so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life that it was almost invisible, taken for granted the way any essential infrastructure eventually becomes. But among a certain class of commercially minded men, the ones who were beginning to think not just about what watermills could do for a neighborhood, but what they might do for a nation, something new was stirring. These men had been reading the reports coming out of England, where water power was already being applied not to the small-scale custom work of a neighborhood grist mill, but to the continuous, systematic production of textiles on a scale that had never before been imagined. The textile mill of Lancashire and Yorkshire were a revelation. Here, the power of falling water had been yoked not to simple grinding or hammering, but to complex multi-stage machinery, carding frames, spinning frames, looms, that could transform raw fiber into finished cloth with a fraction of the human labor that traditional hand production required. The productivity gains were staggering. One water-powered spinning frame could do the work of dozens of hand spinners. The English textile magnates understood what they had, and they protected it fiercely. The export of textile machinery, or of any drawings or specifications related to it, was illegal. The men who built and operated this machinery were forbidden from emigrating. Britain intended to keep its industrial secret, and for a while it succeeded. But secrets travel in human minds, and human minds travel. The story of how British textile technology crossed the Atlantic is one of the great industrial espionage narratives of the early modern world. Though it unfolded quietly, carried in the memory of a young man from Derbyshire named Samuel Slater, who had apprenticed in a cotton mill, memorized what he saw, sailed for America in disguise in 1789, and arrived to find a continent already rich with the water power infrastructure needed to put his knowledge to work. When Slater partnered with the merchant Moses Brown in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and built the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in America, in 1793 he was not introducing water power to America. He was introducing a new and vastly more ambitious vision of what water power could accomplish. The river at Pawtucket had been driving mills of one kind or another for more than a century before Slater arrived. What he brought was not the wheel but the idea that water power could be the foundation of a production system that operated continuously. He employed dozens or hundreds of workers in a single coordinated enterprise that produced not for a local community but for a regional or national market. This was industry in the modern sense, and it grew from the same geological gift that had made a dozen generations of American millers their quiet, community-sustaining livings. The rivers of New England proved particularly well suited to this vision. The Merrimack, the Blackstone, the Connecticut, the Pawtucket. These were rivers that fell hard and fell far, that ran strong through the seasons, that offered not single falls but long stretches of cascading energy, available to be tapped at multiple points. The valleys they carved through the granite hills of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire became, within a generation of Slater's arrival in Pawtucket, some of the most intensively industrialized landscapes on Earth. Mill buildings rose in brick where once there had been only trees and the sound of water. Canals were dug with enormous labor to redirect river flow and maximize the head of water available to drive machinery. Workers, first whole families from the surrounding countryside, then young women from distant farms, then waves of immigrants from Ireland and Quebec and beyond, flooded into these valley towns in numbers that transformed them from villages into cities within a decade. All of it rested on the water wheel. As the scale of the mills grew, the wheels grew with them. The crude wooden paddle wheels of the early colonial period gave way to more refined designs. The breast wheel, the overshot wheel, the pitchback wheel, each one engineered to extract more work from the same volume of water. Eventually, the turbine, a horizontal wheel enclosed in a housing and driven by water pressure rather than weight and momentum, would replace the traditional wheel entirely, offering still greater efficiency in a smaller package. But the principle remained what it had always been. Gravity, working through water, converted into rotation. There is something deeply satisfying about this origin story, something that feels right in a way that the later industrial narrative, steam-powered, coal-hungry city building, sky darkening, sometimes does not. The early American mill worked with the land. It was sited where the land offered power, built from what the land provided, scaled to what the land could sustain. It was not extractive in the way that the coal-fired industries that followed would be extractive. It did not consume the river. It borrowed from it. And when the water had done its work and passed through the mill race and rejoined the river below the wheel, it was the same water it had always been, cold and clear, continuing its long journey to the sea, carrying nothing away but the slight warmth of its exertion and the memory of all the work it had done. It is worth pausing as sleep begins to draw near, to hold that image in the mind. A wooden wheel turning in a cold New England river, the creak of timber, the shimmer of water in the wheel's paddles, catching whatever light is available, morning sun, winter gray, the long amber of a summer afternoon. Inside the millstones turning, flour drifting in the air like slow snow, outside the river continuing, indifferent, generous, inexhaustible. This was how it began. Not with a bang, not with the hiss of steam or the ring of iron, but with the oldest partnership in human history. A person, a river, and the shared understanding that the work of the world could be done more gently, more cleverly, if you were willing to listen to what the water was already trying to tell you. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that Americans have always been proud of, a reluctance to be told that someone else, Saul's already solved the problem, that the answer exists and has been packaged and is available for purchase. It is not always a rational stubbornness. It has cost time and money and occasionally lives, but it has also, in certain remarkable moments in history, produced something that the original solution never could have, something better. The story of how James Watt's steam engine came to America and what Americans did and did not do with it is one of those moments. It is a story about pride and patent law and the particular genius that emerges not from abundance, but from constraint. James Watt did not invent the steam engine. This is worth saying clearly, because history has a habit of collapsing complex lineages into single heroic figures, and Watt has suffered from his own fame in this regard. The steam engine existed before him. Thomas Newcomen had built a working atmospheric steam engine in 1712, a ponderous, slow-breathing machine that used steam not to push, but to create a vacuum, allowing atmospheric pressure to drive a piston downward on each stroke. Newcomen's engine was real and it worked, and it pumped water out of flooded coal mines across England for more than half a century. But it was also spectacularly inefficient, consuming enormous quantities of coal to produce relatively modest amounts of work, because every stroke of the piston required the cylinder to be alternately heated with steam and then cooled with a spray of cold water. All that heating and cooling, over and over hundreds of times an hour, wasted most of the fuel's energy on simply changing the temperature of a large piece of metal. What Watt did, working in Glasgow in the 1760s, with a mind of unusual precision and a patience that bordered on the obsessive, was identify this waste and eliminate it. His key insight was the separate condenser. Instead of cooling the main cylinder to condense the steam, you could route the spent steam into a separate vessel where the condensing happened, leaving the main cylinder always hot and always ready for the next stroke. The efficiency gains were transformative. Watt's engine used roughly a quarter of the coal that a Newcomen engine of equivalent power required. In an industrial economy built on coal, that was not a marginal improvement. It was a revolution. Watt patented his separate condenser in 1769, and then, in partnership with the Birmingham manufacturer and entrepreneur, Matthew Boulton, spent the better part of a decade turning his laboratory invention into a commercial product. By the late 1770s, Boulton and Watt engines were being installed in mines and mills across Britain. By the 1780s, Watt had extended his design to produce rotary motion. The engine no longer just pumped. It turned a shaft, which meant it could drive any kind of machinery. The implications were immediately grasped by the men who ran Britain's textile mills, its ironworks, its breweries. Here was a power source that was not tied to a riverbank. That did not fluctuate with the seasons. That did not freeze in winter or run low in drought. That could be installed wherever coal could be delivered. The water wheel, for all its elegance and its centuries of reliable service, was about to meet its first serious competition. News of all this reached America slowly, and was received with a mixture of fascination and skepticism that was entirely characteristic of the new republic's relationship with European innovation. Americans knew about Watt. His name appeared in newspapers. and in the correspondence of educated men. Thomas Jefferson, who was almost constitutionally incapable of encountering a new mechanical device without wanting to understand and improve it, followed developments in British steam technology with keen interest from his P. Aust as minister to France in the 1780s. Benjamin Franklin, whose mind ranged so freely across the landscape of natural philosophy and practical mechanics, had met Matthew Boulton in Birmingham during his years in England, and had seen something of what Boulton and Watt were building. But knowing about Watt's engine and being able to use it were different things. Boulton and Watt guarded their technology with a legal ferocity that matched the technical sophistication of the engine itself. Their patents were broad and vigorously enforced. In Britain, no one could build an engine incorporating Watt's separate condenser without paying royalties to Boulton and Watt, a requirement the firm enforced through litigation when necessary, and through the sheer weight of its commercial dominance when possible. Beyond the patents, there was the same official policy of industrial secrecy. The export of steam engine components, drawings or specifications, was prohibited. Britain was not going to hand the source of its industrial power to its competitors, least of all to the former colonies that had so recently and so embarrassingly managed to become a nation. So Americans who wanted steam power faced a peculiar situation. They knew the thing existed. They understood, in broad outline, how it worked. They could see from the reports filtering back across the Atlantic what it was doing for British industry. But they could not simply order one, could not hire a Boulton and Watt engineer to come install it, could not consult the technical literature in any detail, because the technical literature that mattered was locked behind a wall of commercial secrecy and legal prohibition. The first steam engines that actually operated on American soil were not Watt engines at all. They were Newcomen-style atmospheric engines, built by local craftsmen working from general knowledge, installed in the 1750s and 1760s to pump water from copper mines in New Jersey and from the city waterworks in Philadelphia. These machines were crude and hungry and slow, but they worked after a fashion, and they introduced a generation of American mechanics to the basic principles of steam at work in a cylinder. The knowledge accumulated slowly, passed between craftsmen, in the way that practical knowledge always travels, through demonstration and imitation, and the particular intimacy of men working together on a difficult problem. The figure who most dramatically embodies the American predicament in those early steam years is Oliver Evans, a Delaware-born miller and inventor of such restless, driving intelligence that he makes most of his contemporaries look tentative by comparison. Evans had taught himself the principles of machinery through years of working in the grain mill industry, and he had a miller's practical obsession with efficiency, with eliminating waste, with finding ways to make a system do more with less. In the 1780s, while still in his 20s, he designed and built what was essentially the world's first continuous production automated mill, a grain processing facility in which the wheat entered at one end and emerged as finished flour at the other, carried through every stage of the process by a system of buckets, conveyors, and Archimedean screws driven by a single water wheel, with minimal human intervention. It was a genuinely extraordinary achievement, decades ahead of comparable developments elsewhere, and it brought Evans a measure of fame and a Pennsylvania patent. But it was steam that consumed him. Evans had grasped something that Watt himself was reluctant to accept, that the real future of the steam engine lay not in the low-pressure atmospheric machines that Watt favored, elegant and safe and efficient as they were, but in high-pressure steam. Watt's engines operated at pressures only slightly above atmospheric, a deliberate conservatism rooted in the legitimate fear that the boilers and cylinders of the day could not safely contain higher pressures. Watt had seen boiler explosions. He knew what steam under pressure could do when containment failed, and he built his conservatism about high pressure into his patents and his engineering philosophy with equal firmness. Evans thought this was wrong. Not reckless, exactly. He understood the dangers as well as anyone, but wrong in its conclusions. He believed that with proper materials and proper design, high-pressure steam was manageable, and that the reward for managing it was an engine far more powerful, far more compact, and far more versatile than anything Watt had built. A high-pressure engine did not need the enormous condenser apparatus that made Watt's machines so large and so expensive. It could exhaust its spent steam directly into the atmosphere, simplifying the design enormously. It could be made small enough to move. That last possibility, a steam engine small enough to move, was the one that Evans pursued with the particular intensity of a man who has seen something others have not yet seen. By the early 1800s, after years of experimentation and the quiet accumulation of practical knowledge about boiler construction and valve timing and the behavior of steam at elevated pressures, Evans had built working high-pressure engines that he was selling commercially to customers in Philadelphia and beyond. He called his engine the Columbia, and he promoted it with a salesman's enthusiasm and an inventor's absolute conviction. He also, in 1804, built something that no one on the American continent had ever built before, a steam-powered vehicle. His Oructor Amphibolos, the name loosely translated from the Greek meant something like amphibious digger, was a flat-bottomed dredging scow fitted with a high-pressure steam engine that could drive it through water, or with the addition of wheels, lumber along a road. It was ungainly and impractical and almost certainly more interesting as a demonstration than as a tool, but it moved under its own steam power through the streets of Philadelphia in the summer of 1805, and the people who watched it move understood, even if they could not have articulated exactly why, that something fundamental had shifted. Evans fought for his ideas the way men of his temperament always fight, loudly, persistently, and with a tendency to make enemies. He sought and obtained patents, including a broad American patent on the high-pressure steam engine that he enforced with a litigiousness that would have impressed Boulton and Watt. He wrote pamphlets and gave demonstrations and argued in print with anyone who questioned his conclusions. He also argued constantly and bitterly with the patent system itself, which he found alternately too weak to protect his inventions and too slow to recognize their importance. American patent law in this period was young and uncertain, its procedures improvised and its enforcement uneven, and Evans spent much of his later life navigating its frustrations. The patent wars that swirled around early American steam development were not simply legal disputes. They were arguments about the future. Who would control the technology that was going to transform American industry? Would it be concentrated in the hands of a few large operators, as Boulton and Watt had concentrated it in Britain, or would it diffuse rapidly through the economy, available to any mechanic with the skill to build an engine and the courage to run it? Evans argued passionately for diffusion, for a world in which his high-pressure engine was a standard tool available to all, though he also wanted to be paid for the privilege of making it so, a contradiction he never entirely resolved. While Evans was fighting his battles in Philadelphia, another set of Americans was approaching the steam problem from a different direction entirely. The question of steam-powered navigation had been tantalizing inventors on both sides of the Atlantic for decades. The idea was obvious. If a steam engine could turn a shaft and a shaft could turn a paddle wheel, you could drive a boat without wind or oars or poles. You could move upstream against a current. You could maintain a schedule regardless of weather. In a country as defined by its rivers as America was, in a period when river travel was the primary means of moving goods and people across any significant distance, a reliable steam-powered boat was not a curiosity. It was a commercial revolution waiting to happen. The man who made it happen, commercially, practically, in a form that actually worked and actually made money, was Robert Fulton. And the story of how he did it is inseparable from the story of how steam technology finally, definitively, crossed the Atlantic. Fulton was an American painter turned engineer who had spent years in Europe, in France and Britain, pursuing his various interests in canal engineering and submarine design, and the practical possibilities of steam navigation. In Britain, he had managed, through a combination of charm, persistence, and the useful credential of being a foreigner who was presumably going to take his knowledge somewhere it couldn't threaten British commercial interests, to examine Boulton and Watt engines at some length. He had measured them and sketched them, and understood how they worked with a thoroughness that went well beyond casual observation. When Fulton returned to America and built the Clermont, the steam-powered vessel that made its famous run up the Hudson River from New York to Albany in August of 1807, the engine at its heart was not an American engine. It was a genuine Boulton and Watt engine, imported from Britain with the connivance of friends and the willful looking away of customs officials, who perhaps understood that the prohibition on exporting such things was, by that point, becoming impossible to enforce. The engine worked. The Clermont worked. The journey took 32 hours, a journey that under sail might take days, and against the current might be nearly impossible. And the people on the riverbanks who watched the strange, smoky, paddle-churning vessel pass did not know quite what to make of it, but they understood that it was real, and that it was not stopping. The Clermont's success opened the floodgates. Steam navigation spread rapidly across the American river system, moving west faster than almost anyone had predicted. Within a decade, steam-powered vessels were running the Ohio and the Mississippi, penetrating the interior of the continent, making navigable in both directions rivers that had previously been one-way highways. The flatboatmen who had poled and drifted goods down to New Orleans and then walked home overland up the Natchez Trace found their world changing around them faster than they could adjust to it. And as steam moved across the water, American mechanics moved with it, learning the engines by living with them, by repairing them in remote places where no Bolton and Watt engineer could be summoned, by improvising solutions to problems that the original designers had never anticipated. This enforced intimacy with the machinery produced something valuable. A generation of American steam engineers who knew these engines not from textbooks, but from necessity. They knew the sounds an engine made when a valve was wearing out, the smell of a packing that, as about to fail, the particular behavior of a boiler when the water level was dropping too fast. This knowledge, distributed across hundreds of riverboats and nascent factories and pumping stations, was the foundation on which the next phase of American industrial development would be built. By the time Watt's original patents expired in Britain in 1800, the situation in America had already moved beyond the point where British patent protection mattered much. American inventors had not simply copied Watt, they had diverged from him. Evans's high-pressure engines were fundamentally different machines from the low-pressure condensing engines that Bolton and Watt sold, different in their operating principles and their materials and their applications. American boilermakers had developed expertise in working with the particular iron available to them, learning its qualities and its limits. American machinists had developed the precision tooling needed to fit pistons and cylinders to tolerances that actually held steam. The industrial knowledge was no longer imported. It was being made here. There is something almost poignant about Watt himself in relation to this American story. He was, by all accounts, a man of genuine warmth and intellectual generosity, who in private correspondence expressed admiration for American ingenuity and a somewhat rueful awareness that his patents could not hold back the tide indefinitely. He had not set out to be a monopolist. He had set out to solve a problem, and the 20 years of commercial protection that his patents gave him had allowed him to do so on his own terms. But technology, like water, finds its way through whatever barriers are placed before it. It seeps through the gaps in legal language. It travels in human memory across oceans that no customs official can effectively police. It emerges, sometimes, in forms that its origin, now creator, would not recognize and might not entirely approve of. What America received from James Watt was not his engine, not exactly. What it received was his demonstration that the thing was possible, that steam, properly understood and properly handled, could be made to work continuously and reliably in service of production. The specific form that Watt had given to that possibility was refined and revised and in some respects abandoned by the Americans who followed him. The high-pressure engines of Oliver Evans, the riverboat engines that accumulated their rough practical wisdom mile by mile up the Mississippi, the factory engines that would eventually begin to supplement and then replace the waterwheels of New England. These were American answers to a British question. They were shaped by American materials and American distances, and American impatience with the pace of things. That same stubborn refusal to accept that someone else had already found the best answer. The water wheel had given America its first industrial generation. Steam would give it the next, but the passage between them was not simple or sudden. It was negotiated over decades, through patent courts and boiler explosions, and long nights of improvised repair in places where help was far away. It was shaped by men like Evans, who saw further than their contemporaries and spent their lives paying the cost of that vision. It was carried across an ocean in the memories of men who had no right to carry it and no intention of asking permission. And it arrived, finally, not as a gift or a theft, but as a transformation, something taken in and worked over and given back, changed, the way all good borrowing eventually works, into something that belonged unmistakably to the place that had made it its own. There are cities that grow the way forests grow, slowly and without a plan, one tree at a time, each one finding its own light and its own water and its own particular angle toward the sky. And then there are cities that are planted, whole and deliberate, conceived in an office, drawn on paper, staked out in a field, and then populated by an act of collective will, so concentrated and so sustained that within a single generation the field has become something that no one who knew it as a field can quite believe. Lowell, Massachusetts is that second kind of city. It should not exist, Nothing about the place, a swampy confluence of two rivers in the rolling hills north of Boston, unremarkable in every geological and geographical particular, suggested that it would become, for a brief and extraordinary moment in the early 19th century, the most intensively industrialized place in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, it did. And the reason it did has everything to do with one man's vision, one city's rivers, and the lives of thousands of young women who came down from the farms of New England and changed American history, without ever quite intending to. Francis Cabot Lowell was not, by the standards of his time and class, an obvious revolutionary. He was a Boston merchant, born in 1775, into one of those interlocking networks of commercial families that dominated the economic and social life of New England. With a thoroughness that was almost feudal, the Lowells knew the Cabots and the Jacksons and the Appletons. They traded together, married into one another's families, sat together in the same church pews and on the same corporate boards. They were not aristocrats in the European sense. There was no title, no ancestral estate, but they occupied a position in Boston society that was understood by everyone, including themselves, to be something more than merely wealthy. They were the people through whose hands the commerce of New England flowed, and they took that responsibility seriously, with a Calvinist seriousness that made pleasure suspect and productivity a form of worship. Lowell made his fortune in the import-export trade, the complex web of commercial relationships that tied New England merchants to the markets of Europe and the Caribbean and the Far East. He was good at it, patient, analytical, gifted at reading the movements of markets and the characters of partners. But the wars of the Napoleonic era, and particularly the American trade embargo of 1807, had made the merchant's life increasingly precarious. Ships sat in harbor. Markets that had been reliable became inaccessible. Men who had built their fortunes on the assumption that the Atlantic would always be open to commerce found themselves staring at ledger books that told a different story. Lowell stared at his ledger books and began to think about manufacturing. He traveled to Britain in 1810, ostensibly for his health, which was genuinely poor and would remain so for the rest of his short life. But his eyes during that trip were working harder than his body. He visited the textile mills of Lancashire and Scotland with a curiosity that went far beyond the polite interest of a tourist. He was doing what Robert Fulton had done before him, what Samuel Slater had done before that, looking very carefully at machines he had no right to copy, memorizing what he saw, storing it in the precise and capacious instrument of a trained mercantile mind. Unlike Slater, who had worked inside the mills and absorbed their operational knowledge from the inside, Lowell was an outsider, a visitor, a gentleman tourist who could not have been permitted to examine the machinery at the level of detail that a working mechanic would have accessed. What he took away was not the specific engineering of the power loom, but something arguably more valuable, a clear understanding of the I-graded system. He saw how the British mills organized the sequence of operations, how raw cotton moved through carding and roving and spinning and weaving in a coordinated flow, how the management of that flow was the central challenge and the central opportunity of the textile business. He came home with a vision, not a blueprint. He didn't have enough technical detail for a blueprint, but a vision of what American textile production could be if it were organized around the integrated mill, a single facility that took in raw cotton and produced finished cloth, controlling every stage of the process, under one roof and one management. This was fundamentally different from the model that Samuel Slater had established in Rhode Island, where mills spun yarn and then put it out to hand weavers in surrounding households to be woven into cloth. Slater's system was efficient for its time, but it was also dispersed and difficult to control. Lowell wanted concentration. He wanted to bring everything inside. To turn vision into hardware, he needed an engineer. And he found one in Paul Moody, a self-taught mechanic from Amesbury, Massachusetts, who possessed exactly the kind of practical genius that Lowell's theoretical understanding required as a complement. Together, over the course of several years working in a small factory in Waltham, they did something remarkable. They reinvented the power loom from first principles. Lowell's memory of what he had seen in Britain gave them a direction. Moody's hands and mind gave them a machine. The power loom they produced was not a copy of anything British. It was an original American design, suited to American materials and American manufacturing capabilities. And it worked. By 1814, the Boston Manufacturing Company's mill in Waltham was producing finished cloth from raw cotton using water-powered machinery in a single integrated facility. It was the first of its kind in America. But Waltham was too small. The Charles River, which powered the Waltham Mill, could not support the scale that Lowell and his partners, the tight circle of Boston merchant families who had invested in the venture, now believed was possible and necessary. They needed more water. They needed, specifically, the kind of dramatic, reliable, year-round water power that only a major river with a significant fall could provide. And they found it, eventually, at a place called Pawtucket Falls on the Merrimack River, about 25 miles north of Boston, where the river dropped some 30 feet in the space of a mile, a sustained cascade of enormous power that had been used modestly to run a few small mills but had never been approached with anything like the ambition that the Boston Associates now brought to it. The land around Pawtucket Falls in the early 1820s was farmland, quiet and unremarkable. The village of East Chelmsford sat nearby, a few hundred people living the agricultural life that New England farming families have lived for generations. The Boston Associates bought the land and the water rights, and an existing canal that had been built to bypass the falls for river navigation, and they began to plan. What they planned was not just a mill, or even a group of mills. What they planned was a city, a complete industrial environment, designed from the beginning to house and employ and civilize a workforce of a scale that had never before been attempted in America. They named it after Francis Cabot Lowell, who had died in 1817 at the age of 42, too soon to see what his vision would become, leaving behind partners who were determined to build it anyway, and a name that would outlast everything else he had done. The design of Lowell was deliberate in every particular. The mills themselves were built in red brick, substantial and permanent-looking, arrayed along a system of canals that the company dug and maintained to distribute the Merrimack's power to the machinery inside. The canals were engineering achievements of the first order, miles of carefully constructed waterways that stepped the river's energy down in stages, delivering it to the mill wheels at the right head and the right volume with a consistency that the river's natural course could never have provided. Walking through Lowell in the 1830s, you would have encountered a landscape that felt unlike anything else in America. A grid of broad, clean streets, lined with brick buildings, the canals running alongside them like slow brown mirrors, the mills rising 4 and 5 stories above the canal banks, their thousands of windows throwing light across the water, and filling those mills, tending those machines, living in the boarding houses that the company built in neat rows within walking distance of the factory gates, were the mill girls. This is the part of the Lowell story that has never lost its capacity to astonish, because the workforce that the Boston Associates recruited to run their grand industrial experiment was not the workforce that anyone observing the early British textile industry would have predicted. In Lancashire, the mills were run largely by families, parents and children together, the children often very young, the working conditions brutal and the living conditions barely better. The British factory system had acquired by the 1820s a reputation for human degradation that troubled even those who profited from it, and Americans who were following the development of British industry were acutely aware of it. The mill owners of Lowell were aware of it too, and they were, for reasons that mixed genuine moral concern with sharp commercial calculation, determined to do something different. What Hay came up with was the boarding house system. Young women, daughters of New England farm families, typically between the ages of 15 and 30, unmarried and looking for a way to earn money before they settled into the domestic life that was understood to be their eventual destination, would come to Lowell to work in the mills. They would live in company-owned boarding houses, supervised by company-employed house mothers, who enforced rules of conduct and curfews and church attendance. They would work long hours, 12 to 14 a day, 6 days a week, in conditions that were noisy and demanding, and not without physical risk. But they would be paid wages, real wages, cash wages, more money than most of them had ever seen or could have earned anywhere else available to women in early 19th century America. And they would be doing so within a carefully constructed social environment designed to reassure their parents that Lowell was not the moral catastrophe that British mill towns were understood to be. The farm families of New England were not immediately convinced. The idea of sending a daughter to a factory city was not one that sat easily with parents, whose understanding of such places had been formed largely by horror stories from Britain. There was recruitment to be done, reassurance to be offered. And the early mill agents who traveled the rural circuits of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont to sign up workers found the work slow and the resistance significant. What gradually turned the tide was money and letters. The money spoke for itself. A mill girl could earn between $2 and $3 a week after her boarding house fees were deducted, at a time when a farm laborer might earn half that. The letters were perhaps more persuasive. The girls who went to Lowell and wrote home to their sisters and cousins described not a degraded, industrial dungeon but something stranger and more interesting. A community of young women, living together, earning their own money, making their own small decisions about how to spend it, encountering books and lectures in the company of other young women from across a wide geography, doing something that felt, in certain lights, almost like freedom. The word freedom is a complicated one to use in this context, and it requires some care. The mill girls were not free in any expansive sense. Their hours were set by the factory bell, which governed their days with a tyranny more absolute than any farmer's seasonal rhythms. The work itself was physically demanding and relentlessly repetitive, tending the spinning frames, watching for broken threads, piecing them back together, walking the length of the frame and back again, hour after hour, in a room filled with the roar of machinery and air thick with cotton lint that settled in the lungs and produced. After years of exposure, the chronic respiratory illness that shadowed the lives of many mill workers, the boarding houses were crowded, 6 or 8 women to a room, with rules about when to be in, and when the lights went out and which church to attend on Sunday morning. The company owned the housing and the stores, and in some respects the social fabric of the city itself. And yet, within those constraints, something genuinely new was happening. These were young women who were earning their own money and making, for perhaps the first time in their lives, choices about how to use it. They bought books. They subscribed to lending libraries. They attended the Lowell Lyceum, where lectures on science and literature and the events of the day drew audiences of hundreds. Some of them wrote poetry and essays and stories, and several of them edited and produced the Lowell Offering, a literary magazine staffed entirely by workers that attracted attention and admiration far beyond the city itself, including from Charles Dickens, who visited Lowell in 1842 and came away astonished, comparing it favorably and explicitly to the mill towns of his own country, where nothing remotely like the Lowell Offering could have been imagined. Dickens's visit is worth pausing on because it captures something important about what Lowell represented in the eyes of the world at its height. He arrived expecting, at some level, the familiar horror of the British factory, the pinched and hollow-eyed children, the filthy streets, the sense of human life ground down to its minimum useful residue. What he found instead was a city that was clean and orderly, and inhabited by young women who seemed, by the standards of industrial labor anywhere on Earth, in 1842, extraordinarily well. He was impressed, and he said so, and his account of Lowell reached a European readership that was hungry for evidence that industrialization did not have to mean degradation. Lowell became, briefly, a kind of argument, a proof that the factory and the human being could coexist, without the factory consuming everything that made the human being worth something. The argument was not entirely honest. The conditions that Dickens observed in 1842 were already beginning to deteriorate from what they had been a decade earlier, and they would continue to deteriorate in the years that followed. The Boston Associates, facing increasing competition from other textile manufacturers, responded the way manufacturers always respond, by pushing harder. The machines were sped up. The number of machines each worker was expected to tend was increased. The wages, which had never been generous, were cut. The boarding house rules became stricter as the company grew more anxious about its workforce's loyalty. The literary magazine continued to publish, but the lives of the women who wrote for it were becoming harder. The gap between the Lowell ideal and the Lowell reality, wider and more difficult to paper over with lectures and library subscriptions. The response, when it came, was also something new. The mill girls organized. They turned out, walked off the job, and coordinated work stoppages that they called turnouts, and that later generations would call strikes. In 1834 and again in 1836, protesting wage cuts and increased boarding house charges with a collective boldness that surprised the company and scandalized some of their contemporaries. Young women, it was widely felt, did not do such things. Young women accepted what they were given and were grateful for it. The mill girls of Lowell declined to accept this characterization. They wrote petitions and circulated them for signatures. They delivered speeches on the steps of the boarding houses. They invoked the memory of the American Revolution, comparing their situation to that of the colonists who had refused to accept unjust impositions from a distant authority, with a rhetorical confidence that suggested they had been spending their off hours in the lending library. rather more productively than their employers had perhaps intended. The turnouts of the 1830s did not succeed in their immediate objectives. The wage cuts went through. The women who led the protests found themselves quietly blacklisted. Their names noted in the company ledgers, their applications for rehire declined without explanation. The power differential between the Boston associates and their workforce was too great for collective action to overcome in those early years, before labor organizing had developed the legal frameworks and the institutional structures that would eventually make it effective. But the turnouts mattered anyway. They established something that would prove important. The mill girls were not passive recipients of whatever the company chose to give them. They were workers, with interests of their own, capable of identifying those interests and acting on them together. The idea, once established, did not go away. By the late 1840s, the character of the Lowell workforce was changing. The mill girls, those daughters of New England farm families who had come for a few years and then returned home to marry, carrying their wages and their experiences with them, were being replaced, steadily and then rapidly, by Irish immigrants fleeing the catastrophe of the famine. The Irish came not for a few years, but permanently, not from a position of relative comfort and choice, but from desperation, and they accepted conditions that the Yankee mill girls had increasingly refused to tolerate. The boarding house system, designed for a transient workforce of respectable young women, gave way to the crowded tenements of a permanent industrial working class. Lowell became, in this second phase, something much more like the British mill towns it had originally been designed to repudiate. But the first phase had happened. It had been real, and it had produced something that could not be undone. A generation of women who had lived independently, earned their own money, read widely, thought carefully about their own condition and the condition of American working people generally, and brought all of that back with them when they returned to the farms and small towns they had come from. The mill girls dispersed across New England and beyond, carrying with them a set of experiences and a set of expectations that the world they returned to had not necessarily prepared for. Some of them became teachers. Some of them became writers. Some of them became activists in the movements for labor reform and women's rights and abolition that would define American public life in the middle decades of the century. Lucy Larcom, who worked in the mills as a child and went on to become a poet of genuine accomplishment, spent the rest of her life writing about Lowell with an ambivalence that was perhaps the most honest response to it, understanding that it had given her something real and charged her something real for it, and being unwilling to pretend that either side of that transaction was simple. Lowell, the city, still exists. The mills still stand along the canals, most of them converted now to apartments and offices and museum space, their red bricks softened by a century and a half of New England weather. The Merrimack still falls at Pawtucket. Standing on the canal bank on a quiet morning, you can hear the water moving through the old gateworks, a sound that has not changed in 200 years, patient and indifferent, and full of the energy that built a city out of a field, and changed in ways still being measured, what it meant to work in America, and what it meant in a country that had always told itself stories about freedom, to try to hold both of those things at once. There is a color that belongs to Pennsylvania in the early 19th century, a color that does not appear in nature with any frequency, but that once you have seen it, you do not forget. It is the color of molten iron, that extraordinary orange-white luminescence that pours from a blast furnace tap like the earth itself has opened and is bleeding light. It is hotter than anything a human hand can approach, hotter than a blacksmith's forge, hotter than a pottery kiln, hotter than almost any industrial process that had existed in America up to that point. And it is beautiful, in the way that dangerous things are sometimes beautiful, with a beauty that has nothing reassuring in it, that asks nothing of you except that you step back and acknowledge that you are in the presence of something that operates entirely outside the scale of ordinary human experience. The men who worked the iron furnaces of Pennsylvania lived their lives in proximity to that color, and it marked them in ways that went deeper than the burns on their hands and the soot in their lungs. It marked their sense of what was possible. It marked their understanding of what the earth contained and what human will and human fire could extract from it. To understand why Pennsylvania became the crucible of American iron, you have to begin, as so many American industrial stories begin, with geography. The Appalachian Mountains that run in long parallel ridges through the central and eastern parts of the state are among the most minerally complex landscapes in North America. They contain iron ore in quantities that early settlers found almost embarrassing. Outcroppings of red and brown rock that colored the streams running off the hillsides, and that any reasonably observant traveler could identify without specialist knowledge. They contain limestone, the flux needed to separate iron from its ore in a blast furnace, in enormous beds throughout the carbonate valleys. And they contain coal, not just any coal, but two distinct kinds of coal that would, in sequence, transform the American iron industry in ways that the men who worked the early furnaces could not have predicted, and might not entirely have welcomed. The first coal was charcoal, which is to say wood transformed by controlled burning into a fuel of concentrated carbon intensity. Charcoal is not technically coal at all, of course. It is a processed wood product. But in the taxonomy of early American iron-making, it occupied the same conceptual space, the fuel that fed the furnace and made the iron run. Every early American iron furnace was a charcoal furnace, dependent on the forests that surrounded it for the raw material of its fuel supply. The iron masters of colonial Pennsylvania and the early Republic were not just industrialists. They were necessarily foresters, because a blast furnace in continuous operation consumed wood at a rate that was almost incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't calculated it. A single furnace might require 6 or 7 square miles of managed forest to sustain its fuel supply, on a rotating basis, cutting a section, letting it regrow over 20 years while cutting elsewhere, cycling through the landscape in a slow rotation that tied the ironmaster to his land as surely as any farmer was tied to his fields. This dependency on forest created the peculiar social geography of the early Pennsylvania iron industry. The iron plantation, unlike the mills of New England, which were urban or at least town-centered enterprises, drawing their labor from a wide surrounding area, the charcoal iron furnace was a rural institution that generated its own community around itself. The ironmaster's house stood at the center, typically a substantial stone building that announced its owner's prosperity and authority. Around it clustered the workers' housing, the company store, the blacksmith shop, the carpenter shop, the ore house, the casting house, and the furnace itself, rising 30 or 40 feet above the surrounding buildings, like a truncated stone pyramid. Its top open to the sky, its interior a column of roaring combustion that never went out for months at a time, once a campaign was begun. Colliers lived in the surrounding forest, tending their smoking mounds of covered wood with a hermit's solitude, emerging periodically to deliver cartload after cartload of charcoal to the furnace bank. Miners worked the ore pits on the hillsides. Teamsters hauled everything from everywhere to everywhere else, along roads that were rough in summer and nearly impassable in the mud seasons of spring and fall. The iron that emerged from these furnaces was cast iron, brittle and hard and useful for a limited but important range of products. Stoveplates, pots and kettles, cannonballs, water pipe, architectural components. It was not the iron that a blacksmith worked. That was wrought iron, produced by a different process called the forge or the finery, in which cast iron was repeatedly heated and hammered to drive out impurities and produce a tougher, more ductile metal. The relationship between furnace and forge was symbiotic, the furnace producing pig iron that the forge refined into bar iron that the blacksmith and the manufacturer could use. This two-stage process was inefficient by later standards, but it worked, and the iron plantations of Pennsylvania worked it with increasing sophistication through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, producing the iron that built a young nation's tools and weapons and domestic infrastructure. The limitation of the charcoal furnace ace was forest. You could only make iron as fast as you could make charcoal, and you could only make charcoal as fast as the trees grew back. The forest imposed a ceiling on production that no amount of technical ingenuity could raise, because the biological growth rate of trees is fixed by biology and not subject to negotiation with market demand. As American demand for iron grew, and it grew with every decade, fueled by westward expansion and the beginnings of industrialization and the seemingly bottomless appetite of a developing continental economy for nails and tools and hardware of every conceivable kind, the charcoal ceiling became increasingly frustrating to the men who ran the furnaces and the merchants who sold the iron. In Britain, this ceiling had been broken decades earlier by Abraham Darby, who had successfully smelted iron with coke, processed bituminous coal, at Coalbrookdale in 1709. Coke is to coal what charcoal is to wood, a processed form of the original material, with the volatile impurities burned off to leave a fuel of high carbon content and structural strength. capable of supporting the weight of the ore burden in a blast furnace without crumbling. Darby's achievement had unlocked the enormous coal reserves of Britain for iron production, freeing the industry from its dependence on increasingly scarce forest and enabling the scale-up that made Britain the iron workshop of the 19th century world. American ironmasters knew about coke smelting. They had known about it for years. What they lacked was the right kind of coal. The bituminous coal that worked beautifully in British coke furnaces was available in Pennsylvania. The great bituminous fields of the western part of the state were well known and increasingly exploited, but it was on the wrong side of the mountains. Getting western Pennsylvania coal to the iron furnaces of the east, valleys meant crossing the Appalachians, a transportation challenge that before the canal and railroad era was simply prohibitive in cost. The iron and coal were both there, in the same state, but separated by a wall of mountains that made them commercially useless to each other. What eastern Pennsylvania had in quantities so vast that early observers could hardly credit their own surveys was a different kind of coal entirely. Anthracite. Hard coal. The stuff that lay in the hills of Schuylkill and Carbon and Luzerne counties, in seams of almost inconceivable thickness, black and dense and lustrous, so hard that it rang like metal when you struck it with a hammer. Anthracite was well known to the people who lived near it. The Lenape had used surface outcroppings. Colonial-era settlers had experimented with it. The problem was that anthracite, unlike bituminous coal and unlike charcoal, was extraordinarily difficult to ignite and even more difficult to keep burning. It required a draft of air more powerful than any conventional fireplace or forge could provide, and without that draft it simply sat in the grate, hard and black and inert, a frustrating lump of potential that refused to become actual. The story of how anthracite was finally tamed for industrial use is one of those stories that exists in multiple contested versions, each one featuring a different hero, each one carrying the particular bias of the community or family that preserved it. What is clear is that by the mid-1820s, a number of experimenters in the anthracite regions of Pennsylvania were working on the problem simultaneously, and that the key insight, that anthracite required a forced air blast of much greater volume and pressure than natural draft could provide, was either discovered or confirmed empirically by more than one person. In roughly the same period, the hot blast, a technique developed in Britain by James Beaumont Nielsen and adapted for American anthracite conditions by a series of Pennsylvania ironmasters, proved to be the crucial enabling technology. Preheating the air before it entered the furnace dramatically increased combustion efficiency and made anthracite not just workable, but superior to charcoal in several important respects. The man most consequently associated with the successful anthracite iron furnace in America is David Thomas, a Welsh iron master who had mastered the hot blast technique in Britain and was recruited to Pennsylvania in 1839 by the Lehigh Crane Iron Company, which had been struggling to make anthracite smelting work at its furnace in Catasauqua. Thomas arrived with the accumulated practical knowledge of a man who had spent his working life inside iron furnaces, understanding their behavior not as a set of chemical principles, but as a set of physical realities that had to be managed through constant attention and adjustment. He rebuilt the Catasauqua furnace according to his own specifications, installed a hot blast apparatus of his own design, and in July of 1840 tapped the first heat of anthracite iron in America that was produced on a commercial scale with reliable, reproducible results. The iron ran out of the tap hole in that familiar orange-white river, pooling into the sand molds that the workers had prepared, cooling slowly into the long rectangular pigs that gave pig iron its name. The image that a casting bed suggests, with its central channel and the subsidiary molds branching off on either side, does look something like a sow nursing a litter, if you are willing to work with the metaphor. But the iron itself was different from charcoal iron in ways that those who handled it could immediately appreciate. It was cleaner. The anthracite, burning at a higher and more consistent temperature than charcoal, drove off more impurities and produced iron of greater uniformity and strength. It was also cheaper because anthracite was available in quantities that made the forests of the charcoal era look like a kitchen garden compared to a prairie, and because the Lehigh Canal and then the railroads could deliver it to the furnace at a cost that declined steadily as transportation infrastructure improved. The anthracite iron industry expanded with a speed that even its most optimistic promoters had not anticipated. Within a decade of Thomas's first successful heat at Catasauqua, Dozens of anthracite furnaces were in blast along the Lehigh and Schuylkill valleys, their stacks rising above the Pennsylvania hills in a new industrial landscape that bore no resemblance to the quiet forest clearings of the charcoal era. The towns that grew up around them, Allentown, Bethlehem, Pottsville, Scranton, were not iron plantations with a single dominant family at their center. They were industrial towns of the modern kind, drawing workers from a wide radius and beyond, from the coal regions of Wales and the iron districts of England and Germany, from the farms of rural Pennsylvania and the failed harvests of Ireland, accumulating populations with a speed that overwhelmed whatever civic infrastructure existed to receive them. The workers who came to these towns entered a world defined by heat and heaviness, and the particular danger of iron. The furnace itself was the central fact, operating around the clock without pause for weeks or months at a time, tended by successive shifts of men who charged the top with ore and limestone and coal, who managed the blast, who watched the color of the flame emerging from the top of the stack, for the signs that told an experienced eye how the reduction was proceeding inside. The cast house floor, where the iron ran at tapping time, was the most dramatic workplace in the industrial world, a chaos of orange light and flying sparks and the low thunder of liquid metal filling the sand molds, the men moving through it in heavy clothing that provided only partial protection from the heat, their faces turned away from the brightest of the light, their knowledge of when to move and where to stand, a knowledge purchased through long experience, and the cautionary example of those who had gotten it wrong. The physical culture of ironwork shaped the men who did it in ways that were visible and ways that were not. Visibly, the iron worker was marked by burns, small and large, the inevitable souvenirs of proximity to liquid metal and superheated surfaces. His lungs were marked by what he breathed, the dust of iron ore and coal and limestone, the gases produced by combustion in the furnace, the general atmospheric assault of an industrial environment that had not yet developed any systematic understanding of occupational health. Less visibly, he was marked by his relationship to danger, a relationship that required a particular psychological calibration, enough respect for the hazards to take reasonable precautions, not so much that the fear became incapacitating, because a man who froze in the cast house was a man who got burned badly, or worse. The iron produced in the Pennsylvania furnaces of the anthracite era went into an American economy that was consuming metal, with an appetite that grew faster than any furnace could satisfy it. Rails were perhaps the most voracious consumer. The railroad expansion of the 1840s and 1850s laid thousands of miles of track across the eastern United States, and every mile of track required tons of iron, first in the form of strap iron spiked to wooden rails and then in increasingly heavy rolled iron rails that required enormous rolling mills to produce. The mills that rolled Pennsylvania era and into rails were themselves significant industrial establishments, their steam-powered rolls turning billets of iron into the precisely dimensioned lengths of metal on which the locomotives ran. The locomotive itself was iron. The bridges that carried the tracks over the rivers and valleys of Pennsylvania and beyond were iron. The water mains of the growing cities were iron. Iron was not just an industrial material in the middle of the 19th century. It was the material of modernity itself, the substance out of which the physical infrastructure of an industrializing nation was being made. And yet iron, for all its utility, had a limitation that was becoming more apparent as the demands placed on it grew more extreme. It was not consistent. The properties of any given batch of iron depended on the ore, the fuel, the technique, the weather, the experience of the men running the furnace, and a dozen other variables that were imperfectly understood and imperfectly controlled. Iron rails cracked under the weight of heavy locomotives moving at speed. Iron bridges failed under loads that calculation suggested they should have supported. The structural unpredictability of iron was not merely an inconvenience. It was a barrier to the heavier locomotives, the longer spans, the taller buildings, the larger machines that an expanding industrial civilization was trying to build. What was needed was steel. Steel, iron alloyed with a precisely controlled small percentage of carbon, neither the excess carbon of cast iron nor the near absence of carbon of wrought iron, but exactly the right amount, producing a material that combined the hardness of one with the toughness and ductility of the other, had been known and prized for centuries. The finest swords in the world were steel, the best cutlery was steel, but steel had always been produced in small batches, by slow and expensive processes that limited it to high-value applications. where the cost could be justified. Making steel in the quantities that a railroad economy required was simply not possible with the techniques that existed before the mid-19th century. The solution, when it came from Britain first, as industrial solutions so often did in this period. Henry Bessemer's converter, patented in 1856, was a vessel in which molten pig iron could be transformed into steel in minutes by blowing a blast of air through the liquid metal, burning off the excess carbon with a speed and efficiency that the old slow methods could not approach. The Bessemer process was not without its complications. It was sensitive to the sulfur and phosphorus content of the iron it processed, and some Pennsylvania ores proved less amenable to it than others. But it worked, and when it worked at a scale that changed everything. The Pennsylvania iron industry received the Bessemer process, not as a disruption but as a completion. The anthracite furnaces had built the iron capacity, the transportation infrastructure, the workforce of experienced metal workers, the managerial knowledge, and the commercial networks that the steel age would need. The Lehigh Valley and the Pittsburgh region had the ore, the coal, the rivers, the rails. They had, above all, the accumulated human capital of 3 decades of intensive iron production. The engineers and iron masters and furnace keepers and rolling mill operators who understood metal in their bones and who could adapt to a new process with a speed that no freshly established industry could have matched. When Andrew Carnegie built his Edgar Thomson Steel Works near Pittsburgh in 1875 and equipped it with Bessemer converters, he was not creating an American steel industry from nothing. He was harvesting what the Pennsylvania iron furnaces had planted over the previous half-century. The anthracite era had been the preparation, the long, slow building of a foundation whose purpose became clear only when the steel age arrived to stand upon it. The charcoal iron masters who had burned the forests of eastern Pennsylvania to make the metal for a young nation's tools had themselves been the preparation for the anthracite furnaces. David Thomas at Catasauqua had been the preparation for Carnegie at Pittsburgh. Each generation of Pennsylvania iron had made the next one possible, each one burning hotter and running faster and demanding more of the earth and the men who worked it. The furnaces are mostly cold now, the stacks that remain in the state parks and historic sites of the Lehigh Valley are stone monuments to a fire that burned for a century and then went out, leaving behind a landscape of remarkable industrial archaeology and an air that is cleaner than it has been since before the first furnace was lit. But the steel that those furnaces made their small contributions toward enabling is still everywhere, in the bridges and the rails and the structural frames of buildings that have stood for 100 years and will stand for 100 more. And on certain autumn evenings in the Pennsylvania hills, when the light comes at a particular low angle and catches the old stone walls of a furnace stack still standing in the trees, you can almost see that color again, that extraordinary orange-white that does not appear in nature, burning somewhere deep in the memory of the rock itself. Before you understood anything else about the mill, you heard it. Long before you reached the building itself, before you could see the windows lit against the pre-dawn dark, or smell the particular combination of machine oil and heated metal and processed fiber that lived in the air around it, the mill announced itself through sound. It was not a single sound, but a texture of sound, a woven thing made of many threads, the deep rhythmic thudding of the main shafting that ran the length of the building, the higher whirring of the belts that carried power from the shafts to the individual machines, the clatter and knock of the looms or the frames or the stamps depending on what the mill made. And underneath all of it, so constant and so pervasive that it ceased after a few days to register a sound at all, and became instead simply the condition of existence inside those walls. The roar. It was not a roar like a lion or a fire or a crowd, though it contained elements of all three. It was the roar of mechanism, of hundreds of moving parts, each making its small contribution to a collective noise that added up to something beyond the sum of its components. Something that pressed against the eardrums and the chest simultaneously, and that you carried home with you at the end of the shift, ringing in your ears and humming in your sternum long after the building was behind you. This was the world that several 100,000 American men and women and children entered every morning in the decades between 1820 and 1860. And it is worth trying to inhabit it with some care, because the tendency of history is to look at these people from the outside, to count them and categorize them, and measure their wages, and calculate their working hours, and in doing so to miss the texture of what it actually felt like to be inside those buildings, doing that work, in that body, on that particular morning. The numbers matter, The politics matter. The economics matter enormously. But the sensory reality of the early American factory is where the human story lives, and it deserves attention on its own terms. The shift began before light. This was not a metaphor or an approximation. In the winter months, a worker reporting F or the 5 or 5:30 start that most mills required would walk to the factory in full darkness, guided by the light from the mill windows and the sound that carried through the cold air with particular clarity. The bell that called the workers was not a gentle thing. It was a large bell mounted on the roof or in a purpose-built bell tower, and it rang with an authority designed to reach every boarding house and tenement within a radius of several blocks, penetrating sleep and dreams and the warmth of shared beds with equal indifference to all of those things. Workers who failed to appear promptly were docked wages. Workers who were chronically late were dismissed. The bell did not negotiate. Inside the mill, the first sensation was heat. Not the comfortable heat of a well-tended hearth, but a damp, pressing, institutional heat generated by the machinery itself and by the bodies of the workers, and, in textile mills, by the deliberate humidification of the air to keep cotton and wool fibers from breaking under tension. In winter, this heat was, for the first few minutes, almost welcome after the cold of the walk to work. By mid-morning, it had become simply the medium in which you existed, something you no longer noticed except on the rare occasions when a window was opened, and a draft of outside air moved through the room with the startling quality of a small miracle. In summer, the heat was another thing entirely. Summer in a textile mill, with the machinery running and the windows closed against the drafts that would break the threads, and with the August sun adding its contribution to everything the machines were already doing, was a sustained physical ordeal that workers described in terms that left no room for romanticizing. You sweated through your clothes within the first hour. You drank water when you could get to it. You counted the hours with a specificity you did not bring to more comfortable days, each one a small achievement, a portion of the distance between the opening bell and the closing one. The light inside the mill was inadequate by almost any standard we would recognize. The windows were large by the standards of the period, deliberately so, because natural light was the primary illumination, and the work required enough visibility to manage fine mechanical processes without constant error. But the buildings were also deep, and the interior rows of machines were far from any window, and the light that reached them was compromised and uneven. In the early morning, and in the winter months, when natural light was insufficient even near the windows, the mills burned oil lamps, or, by the 1840s, increasingly gas lamps whose yellowish flame added its own heat and its own smell to the already complex atmosphere of the workroom. The combination of inadequate light and the need for sustained visual attention to the machinery produced, over years of work, the characteristic eye strain and headaches that mill workers mentioned frequently in their letters and diaries. Spectacles were not uncommon among workers considerably younger than the age at which most people today would begin to need them. The floor beneath your feet vibrated. This is something that accounts of mill work mention often enough that it must have been a significant part of the physical experience. But it is also something that is genuinely difficult to imagine if you have never stood on a floor through which several hundred horsepower of mechanical force is being transmitted. The vibration was not violent. The machines were bolted down. The building was constructed to absorb and distribute the forces involved, but it was constant, a trembling that traveled up through the soles of your feet and into your legs, and that, combined with the noise and the heat, created a total sensory environment that was unlike anything available in the world outside the factory walls. Workers new to the mills described a period of adjustment that lasted days or weeks, during which the body and the nervous system gradually accommodated to conditions that initially felt overwhelming. Veterans described a kind of settling in, a recalibration of the senses, that allowed them to work effectively inside the din and heat, without the constant acute awareness of it that newcomers experienced. What the veteran worker had that the newcomer lacked was attention, not more of it but better directed. The skill of factory work in this period was not primarily physical strength, though strength was required in many operations. Nor was it the kind of intellectual engagement that we associate with craft work, the constant problem-solving of the carpenter or the wheelwright who encounters a different challenge in every piece. It was something closer to a highly specialized form of awareness, an ability to monitor multiple machines or multiple processes simultaneously through peripheral vision and hearing, and the subtle tactile feedback of hands in contact with running machinery, noticing the deviations from normal, the wrong sound, the wrong feel, the thread that was beginning to drift off true. before they became problems that stopped production or damaged equipment. In a cotton spinning room, a single operative might be responsible for tending 4 or more spinning frames, each one carrying dozens of spindles, each spindle drawing and twisting its thread in a process that required constant monitoring for breaks, walking the length of the frames and back, watching the threads, piecing the breaks with fingers that had learned through long repetition to find the broken ends and rejoin them with a speed that seemed impossible to anyone watching for the first time. The experienced spinner was operating in a state of continuous distributed attention that was genuinely demanding in ways that are easy to underestimate. The work was repetitive, yes, but repetitive work is not necessarily simple work, and the cost of inattention in a spinning room was measured in broken threads and lost production, and, in the worst cases, in fingers caught in machinery that did not stop for human error. The machinery itself was the central physical fact of the factory worker's existence, and the relationship between worker and machine was more complex than the conventional image of industrial alienation suggests. The machines were dangerous. This was simply true, and no amount of familiarity or skill entirely eliminated the danger. Exposed gearing and shafting and belts were everywhere, moving at speeds that could catch a piece of clothing or a strand of hair and produce a catastrophic injury in the fraction of a second it took for the fabric or the hair to wind up into the mechanism. Mill records from this period contain, alongside the production figures and the wage accounts, columns of injury reports that read with a terrible matter-of-factness: fingers lost, hands crushed, arms taken at the elbow, the occasional death. Workers learned to move through the machinery in particular ways, to hold their bodies and their clothing in particular configurations that minimized the risk. And this knowledge was part of what experience in the mill gave you, but it was never a guarantee. And yet workers also developed genuine relationships with their machines, the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from spending 12 or 14 hours a day in close proximity with something that you are responsible for keeping running. Experienced operatives knew their machines the way musicians know their instruments, knew the particular sounds that indicate DA bearing wearing out or a belt beginning to slip, knew the adjustments that would keep a frame running smoothly when the humidity changed or the quality of the fiber shifted. This knowledge was valuable. It was also, in a small but real way, a form of power, because the worker who knew the machine was less replaceable than the worker who merely tended it, and in the constant background negotiation between management and labor over the terms of industrial work, irreplaceability was one of the few cards that workers held. The 14-hour shift, roughly the standard in American mills during the height of the early industrial period, with some variation by season, since mills often ran longer in summer when daylight extended the working day, is a duration that requires some effort to hold in the imagination. 14 hours is not simply a long workday in the way that 10 hours or even 12 is a long workday. It is a span of time that consumes the day entirely, leaving at its end only enough time for the walk home, a meal if one has the energy to eat it, and a few hours of sleep before the bell rings again. The workers who lived this schedule were not merely tired in the ordinary sense. They existed in a state of managed exhaustion that became, over months and years, the baseline of their physical experience, the condition against which all other states were measured. The meal breaks that punctuated the shift, typically 30 minutes for breakfast and 30 minutes for dinner, which in the usage of the period meant the midday meal, were not generous, but they were valued with an intensity proportional to their scarcity. Workers ate quickly and, when weather permitted, sometimes ate outside in the mill yard or on the loading dock, where the air was different from the air inside, and where the absence of machinery noise had a quality that could almost be called silence even when it was not. The social life of the mill concentrated itself in these breaks with a natural pressure, the conversation that had been impossible inside the workroom finding its release in the brief windows of relative quiet. News traveled at mealtimes. Grievances were aired, friendships were sustained, and occasionally romances were pursued with the efficiency that limited time imposed on everything. Because the social lives that formed around the early mills were not, by any measure, the impoverished and constrained affairs that the conditions of work might seem to predict. This is perhaps the aspect of early industrial life that most consistently surprises people who encounter it for the first time. The degree to which workers managed to construct rich, complex, sustaining communities inside and around the framework of the factory. The mills created concentrations of people who might otherwise never have met, young women from different corners of New England in the boarding houses of Lowell, men from half a dozen countries in the iron towns of Pennsylvania, and concentrations of people given time and proximity and shared experience tend to generate culture. In the textile mill towns, the boarding house was the social center of workers' lives outside the factory. In Lowell and the towns that modeled themselves on it, these were company-owned buildings managed by house mothers whose role was simultaneously domestic and supervisory, responsible for feeding and housing their charges, and also for maintaining the standards of respectability that the companies advertised as a feature of their operations. The rules were real and they were enforced. Curfews, mandatory church attendance, prohibitions on male visitors in the rooms, expectations about behavior that would have been recognized as reasonable by the farm families who had sent their daughters to tea mills, and that were experienced by those daughters with varying degrees of acceptance and resentment depending on temperament and circumstance. Within those rules, the boarding houses were alive. In the evenings after supper, in the hours before the curfew closed down the day, the common rooms and the shared bedrooms were places of remarkable social intensity. Books circulated. The lending libraries and the circulating collections that workers built among themselves moved through the boarding houses in a constant flow. Novels and poetry, and the improving literature that the period was so fond of producing, and that the mill girls consumed with an appetite that surprised observers from outside. Letters were written, the long, careful, news-filled letters that were the primary means of maintaining connection with the family in the village left behind. And letters were read aloud, because the news they contained was often community news that everyone in the house had an interest in. Singing happened, in the informal way that singing happens when people who share a space have voices and the inclination to use them. The parlor songs and the hymns, and occasionally something racier that the house mother might or might not have chosen to ignore. The friendships formed in those boarding houses were often the most significant relationships of the mill girls' lives. The bonds forged in the particular intimacy of shared beds and shared hardship and shared laughter at the end of exhausting days. Women who had come to the mill from the same town or the same county sought each other out and formed tight clusters of mutual support. Women who arrived alone and knew nobody found themselves absorbed into the social fabric of the house, with a speed that the density of the community made possible. The turnover was high. Most mill girls stayed for a few years and then left, returning home to marry or moving on to other opportunities. But the community itself was stable, constantly refreshed by new arrivals who were absorbed into existing patterns of sociability that had been established by their predecessors. In the iron and mining towns, the social world was shaped by different forces. These were not predominantly young and transient communities, but communities of families, often immigrant families, who had come with the intention of staying, who were building lives rather than accumulating a dowry or a nest egg before returning home. The ethnic geography of the Pennsylvania iron districts was remarkably complex. Welsh and English and Irish and German communities existing in close proximity, each one maintaining its own churches and its own social organizations, and its own particular relationship to the work. Because different immigrant groups tended to concentrate in different occupations, the Welsh were disproportionately represented in the skilled positions of the ironworks, bringing with them a tradition of iron-making knowledge that went back generations. The Irish concentrated in the heavier and less skilled labor. The Germans brought their own craft traditions and their own organizational habits. The church was the central institution of the mill town in a way that is difficult to overstate. Because in a world without the secular social infrastructure that we take for granted, without community centers or public parks, or the range of commercial entertainments that would develop later in the century, the church organized time and provided community and gave meaning and performed many of the social functions that we have since distributed across a dozen different institutions. The mill town typically had several churches, denominations competing not just for souls, but for the social allegiance of the community, because membership in a church meant membership in a network of mutual aid and social connection that had real practical value. Weddings and funerals and baptisms were the punctuation marks of community life, the occasions on which the private experiences of individual families became public events in which the whole community had a stake. The tavern was the church's secular complement, and in mill towns where the work was heavy and the hours were long and the need for something at the end of the shift that was neither sleep nor more work was acute, it occupied a significant place in the social landscape. Mill owners were generally hostile to taverns, not from moral reasons alone, though moral reasons were always available to be cited, but from the practical recognition that a workforce that drank heavily was a workforce that showed up late and worked carelessly and had accidents. The tension between the workers' need for release and the owners' need for reliable production played itself out in the regulation of drinking in mill towns across America, with results that satisfied neither side and that drove some of the drinking underground or across the jurisdictional line into neighboring towns beyond the company's influence. But there were also simpler pleasures, quieter ones, that the mill town offered its inhabitants and that do not appear in the records of labor disputes or temperance campaigns because they were too ordinary to be remarkable. The fishing in the mill race after the working day was done. The kitchen gardens that workers cultivated in whatever ground they could claim, growing the vegetables that supplemented the boarding house diet or the family table. The seasonal rhythms that persisted even inside the industrial economy. The community haymaking and corn husking and apple pressing that brought people together in collaborative labor of the kind that had always been how rural communities refreshed their social bonds. The children playing in the mill yard on Sunday, the one day the machines were still. The midnight mills, those that ran their machinery through the night, as some did in periods of peak demand, as all of them seemed to do in the imagination of the era, their windows throwing light across the dark town, were not only instruments of production, they were also, whether their owners intended it or not, generators of community. They gathered people together in numbers large enough to create culture. They created shared experience intense enough to create solidarity. They created shared grievance, sharp enough to create, eventually, organized resistance. The social lives that formed around them were not a byproduct of the industrial process. They were, in their way, as significant a product as the cloth or the iron or the flour, the human thing that emerged from all that heat and noise and exhaustion, the irreducible evidence that people will find ways to be people in almost any circumstances, and that the circumstances, however demanding, do not get the final word. The bell rang at the end of the shift the way it had rung at the beginning, without sentiment or acknowledgement of what the hours between had asked of the people inside. Workers filed out into whatever the weather had become since morning, into light or dark depending on the season, carrying the mill home in their bodies the way they always did, the noise still ringing, the heat still in the skin, the vibration of the floor still remembered in the soles of the feet. And then they went back to the boarding houses and the tenements and the small company houses, and they ate, and they talked, and some of them read and some of them sang, and some of them simply sat in the particular exhausted silence of people who have given the day everything. Gee, they had. And in the morning, the bell rang again. Distance, in early America, was not merely an inconvenience. It was a fact of existence so fundamental and so pervasive that it shaped everything built within it. The size of communities, the nature of commerce, the reach of government, the texture of daily life, the horizon of human ambition itself. A farmer in the Ohio Valley in 1820, who grew more corn than his family could eat, faced a problem that had no easy solution, because the corn that represented his surplus and his prosperity was also heavy, and bulk, and perishable, and the roads between his farm and any market large enough to absorb it were, in the most charitable description available, challenging. They were rutted in summer and frozen in winter and bottomless in the mud seasons between, traversed by wagons that moved at the pace of the oxen pulling them, which is to say at the pace of a slow walk, which is to say at perhaps 2 miles an hour on a good day, over good ground, with a light load. To move 100 bushels of corn from central Ohio to a coastal market by wagon would have cost more in time and labor and wear on the animals than the corn was worth. The distance did not merely complicate commerce, it made certain kinds of commerce impossible. The rivers helped where rivers ran in useful directions, which was not always where people needed them to run. The Ohio and the Mississippi carried enormous quantities of goods southward toward New Orleans, and the flat-bottomed keel boats and barges that worked those rivers were the arteries of a real and growing interior economy. But rivers ran where geology had put them, not where commerce required them. And they ran in one useful direction, which meant that getting anything back upstream against the current was a labor of such heroic difficulty that it constrained the development of any trade that required exchange rather than simple export. The advent of the steamboat changed the upstream problem profoundly, as we have seen, but it did not change the fundamental geographic reality that rivers were fixed features of the landscape, and that the vast interior of the continent contained enormous stretches of territory that no navigable waterway touched, or would ever touch. What America needed, and what its most ambitious thinkers had understood it needed since the earliest years of the Republic, was a way of moving goods and people across the landscape that was not dependent on the direction of rivers, or the condition of roads, or the muscular capacity of animals. What it needed was something that could go anywhere that track could be laid, regardless of terrain or season, carrying loads that no wagon team could manage, at speeds that no horse could sustain. What it needed, though the word had not yet fully attached itself to the concept when men first began dreaming of it, was the railroad. The idea of vehicles running on rails was older than the steam engine. Wooden railways had been used in European mines since the 16th century. The flanged wheels of ore carts following wooden or iron-capped tracks through the underground darkness with a smoothness and efficiency that ordinary ground could not provide. The principle was simple and its advantage obvious. A flanged wheel on a smooth rail faces far less rolling resistance than a wheel on any road surface, which means that the same force can move a much greater load. A horse that could pull perhaps a ton on a good road could pull several tons on a well-laid iron rail. The rail was a force multiplier, and the men who built the early mines understood this even before anyone had thought to attach a steam engine to the front of the cart. The first steam locomotives emerged in Britain in the first decade of the 19th century, the work of Richard Trevithick, who built a steam-powered vehicle that ran on rails at an ironworks in South Wales in 1804, and George Stephenson, whose more refined designs formed the practical basis of the locomotive technology that would spread across the world in the decades that followed. Stephenson's rocket, which won the Rainhill trials in 1829 and demonstrated to a watching world that a steam locomotive could achieve speeds and haul loads that skeptics had declared impossible, is usually taken as the moment when the railroad ceased to be an interesting experiment and became an inevitable future. The rocket reached nearly 30 miles an hour during the trials, a speed that caused genuine astonishment among observers who had grown up in a world where 30 miles an hour was something that only fell things achieved. America received the news from Rainhill with the mixture of excitement and competitive anxiety that had by now become its characteristic response to British industrial achievement. There were Americans who had been thinking about steam locomotion independently, following the same logic that had led Evans and Fulton and their contemporaries to the steam-powered vehicle and the steam-powered boat. John Stevens of New Jersey had built a small experimental steam locomotive that ran on a circular track on his estate in Hoboken as early as 1825, 4 years before the rocket's triumph, and had spent years petitioning state and federal governments to support the development of a railroad network with the same public-spirited persistence that characterized the generation of founders who understood infrastructure as a national project. Stevens was largely ignored in his own time, but he was right about nearly everything, and the world that eventually arrived bore a close resemblance to the one he had been arguing for. The first American railroads, were modest affairs, dealt with British technology and in some cases British locomotives, operating over short distances and conceived primarily as feeders to the canal networks that were then the most advanced transportation infrastructure the country possessed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, was built to connect Baltimore to the Ohio River, a route that would allow the city to compete with New York and Philadelphia for the trade of the interior. The South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company built a line from Charleston to Hamburg that was, when completed in 1833, the longest railroad in the world, under single management, a distinction that said less about American ambition than about how short all railroads still were at that early date. The Camden and Amboy in New Jersey, the Mohawk and Hudson in New York, the Philadelphia and Columbia in Pennsylvania. These early lines were short and slow, and technically imperfect, their equipment unreliable, and their operations improvised in ways that produced frequent delays and occasional disasters. But they worked. They worked well enough, even in their imperfect early state, to demonstrate the fundamental reality that would drive everything that followed. The railroad was not merely faster than existing transportation, it was faster by a margin so large that it constituted a qualitative change rather than a quantitative one. A journey that took a week by wagon took a day by rail. Goods that had been too bulky or too heavy to move economically at wagon speeds became perfectly viable commercial products at rail speeds. The calculation that had made the Ohio farmer's corn surplus commercially worthless suddenly inverted itself. Distance, which had been the fundamental constraint of American economic life, had not been eliminated, but it had been dramatically and permanently compressed. The compression was not uniform, and its uneven application across the landscape created winners and losers in patterns that were sometimes predictable and sometimes shocking. The towns that the railroad reached grew. They grew quickly, and they grew in particular ways, acquiring the warehouses and the hotels and the commercial establishments that the railroad's traffic generated, becoming nodes in a network whose logic was the logic of flow, goods and people moving through, being processed, being redistributed, generating economic activity at every stage of the transit. The towns that the railroad bypassed contracted. Sometimes they contracted gradually, losing population to nearby railroad towns as the economic gravity of the network pulled people toward the points of connection. Sometimes they contracted with a speed that was genuinely alarming, the commercial life draining out of them, within a few years of a railroad being built along a different route, leaving behind buildings that had been constructed in the expectation of a future that had been redirected elsewhere. The railroad company's decision about where to run the line was therefore one of the most consequential acts of private power in 19th century America, a decision that made and unmade communities with a casualness that those communities found infuriating and that they were largely powerless to resist. Town boosters understood this, and the competition between communities for railroad connections was fierce and sometimes corrupt, involving land grants and bond issues and outright bribes as towns attempted to make themselves attractive to the railroad companies, whose routes would determine their fate. The railroad had become the arbiter of the American future, and everyone who understood the stakes was trying to influence the verdict. The locomotives that pulled the early American trains were, by later standards, small, and fragile, and demanding of constant attention. The men who drove them, engineers in the specific sense of the word that the railroad gave to American English, occupied a position in the occupational hierarchy of the time that was unusual and revealing. They were skilled workers of high status, commanding wages significantly above the industrial average, and a degree of public respect that reflected the genuine difficulty and responsibility of their work. Operating a locomotive in the 1830s and 1840s required a combination of mechanical knowledge, physical courage, and the particular form of vigilance that comes from being responsible for a machine that could kill you and your passengers if you lost your attention for a moment. The early locomotives were prone to boiler explosions, to broken axles, to derailments on track that was often imperfectly laid and imperfectly maintained. The engineer who brought his train through without incident was performing a skilled service that his passengers appreciated in the most immediate possible way. The passengers themselves were experiencing something unprecedented. Speed was not in 1835 or 1840 the casual and unremarkable experience that it would eventually become. People had traveled on horseback and by coach and by boat, but the fastest of these, the horse at full gallop, was an intermittent and exhausting experience that could not be sustained. The train moved at 20 or 30 miles an hour continuously, for hours through landscapes that unrolled past the windows, with a visual rhythm that was entirely new to human experience. Early passengers wrote about this sensation with a freshness that makes their accounts some of the most vivid records of what the railroad revolution actually felt like. The landscape did not move past as it did from a coach window, at a pace that allowed the eye to dwell on individual feet, yours, and compose them into a coherent picture. It streamed. Trees close to the track blurred into a green rush. Distant hills rotated slowly against the sky. The whole visual experience of travel was transformed in ways that would take decades for painters and writers to process, and that would eventually generate entirely new aesthetic responses to landscape and motion. The railroad did not just carry passengers. It carried everything. And the transformative effect on American commerce was most visible not in the passenger car, but in the freight car, that unglamorous workhorse of the industrial economy that moved the coal and the iron and the grain and the timber and the finished goods that were the actual substance of national prosperity. Before the railroad, the cost of inland freight was a tax on economic activity that shaped what could be produced, and where and in what quantity. After the railroad, that tax was dramatically reduced across every route where rail replaced road or river, and the reduction changed the economic geography of the continent in ways that are still shaping it. The coal industry of Pennsylvania is perhaps the most dramatic example. The anthracite fields of the eastern part of the state contained some of the largest coal reserves in the world, but for decades that coal had been accessible only to communities near enough to reach it by canal. The canals were good, and they moved impressive quantities of coal, but they were slow, and they froze in winter, and they were limited to the valleys through which they had been excavated. The railroads that were built into the coal regions in the 1840s and 1850s blew the market for Pennsylvania anthracite open to dimensions that the canal era had not approached. Coal that had cost several dollars a ton to deliver to New York by canal could be delivered for less than half that by rail, and at volumes that the canals could not match. The price of heating fuel in American cities fell, and as it fell, coal replaced wood as the primary domestic fuel of the urban Northeast, which meant that the forests that had supplied that fuel received some small respite, and the coal mines of Pennsylvania employed more men and produced more coal and fed more locomotives and generated more economic activity in the self-reinforcing cycle that the industrial economy was becoming. The relationship between the railroad and the iron industry was similarly circular and similarly explosive in its effects. The railroads needed iron, enormous quantities of iron, for rails and locomotives and bridges and the 1,000 other components of the system. The iron industry needed the railroad to move its products to market and its raw materials to the furnace. Each one made the other more possible, and as both grew, the growth of each accelerated the growth of the other, in a feedback loop that drove American industrial output upward at rates that seemed, to people living through them, almost miraculous. The inland towns that the railroad reached underwent transformations that contemporaries consistently described with the language of before and after, as if the railroad's arrival had divided local time into two distinct eras with a sharp boundary between them. Before, a town might have been a modest agricultural service center, its commerce limited to the surrounding countryside, its connection to wider markets slow and expensive, and seasonally interrupted. After, the same town might find itself processing goods from 100 miles away and shipping its own products to markets it had never previously been able to reach, its population growing as workers arrived to service the expanded commerce, its built environment changing as the boarding houses and warehouses and commercial establishments of a more complex economy replaced the simpler structures of the agricultural town. Springfield, Illinois, Indianapolis, Indiana, Columbus, Ohio. These cities did not grow gradually and organically in the way that coastal cities had grown, accumulating their size over generations through the slow compounding of commercial advantage. They were pulled into urban significance by the railroad, sometimes within a single decade, their growth rates reflecting the artificial acceleration that railroad access imposed on the places it touched. The men and women who arrived in these cities in the 1840s and 1850s were participating in an urban experiment that had no real precedent in American history, the creation of significant cities in the interior of a continent by the deliberate application of transportation technology. The Irish were everywhere in this story. The construction of the American railroad network was performed in significant part by Irish immigrant laborers. The same famine-driven diaspora that was filling the textile mills of New England also filled the railroad construction gangs that pushed the lines westward across the continent. These men worked with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, cutting through hills and filling valleys, and laying the graded roadbed on which the track would rest, at wages that were low and in conditions that were dangerous, and in environments that were often far from any established community. The railroad construction camp was its own social world, moving westward as the line advanced, leaving behind it a transformed landscape and the graves of men who had not survived the work. The telegraph, which developed in close symbiosis with the railroad in the 1840s, amplified the railroad's transformative effect in ways that extended beyond the physical movement of goods and people. The wire that ran alongside the track carried information at a speed that made even the locomotive seem slow, reducing the transmission time of news from days or weeks to minutes across any distance the wire reached. A merchant in Cincinnati could receive information about prices in New York in the time it took an operator to tap out and receive a message, and could make decisions based on that information while it was still current. The railroad moved the goods. The telegraph coordinated the movement. Together they created something that had not previously existed in America, a genuinely integrated national market, in which prices in different cities tended toward equilibrium because the information needed to exploit price differences traveled as fast as the arbitrage opportunity could be identified. The effect on American agriculture was as significant as the effect on industry, and in some ways more surprising. The farmers of the interior had always grown food. What the railroad gave them was the ability to specialize, to grow the crops best suited to their soil and climate rather than the crops needed for local subsistence, because the railroad could bring whatever they chose not to grow, from wherever it grew best. The wheat farmers of Illinois and Indiana could send their grain east by rail and receive back the manufactured goods they needed, and both sides of the exchange could operate at scales and efficiencies impossible in the pre-railroad era. The American Midwest became, in the railroad decades, the most productive agricultural region in the world, not because its soils were uniquely fertile, though they were very good, but because the railroad made that fertility economically accessible in a way it had never been before. Chicago is the city that most purely embodies what the railroad did to American geography, because Chicago had almost nothing to recommend it as a major city except its position. It sat at the southwestern corner of Lake Michigan, on flat, swampy ground in a climate of formidable severity, with no particular natural advantage, except that it was where the lake met the prairie, where the water transportation of the Great Lakes met the agricultural hinterland of the interior. When the railroads began to converge on Chicago in the 1840s and 1850s, drawn by its position at the junction of water and land routes, the city grew with a speed that became legendary even to those watching it happen. In 1840, Chicago had a population of about 4,000. By 1860, it had over 100,000. The railroad had not created Chicago's geographic position. It had made that position matter in a way that it had not mattered before, and the city had grown to fill the significance that geography and technology together had assigned to it. By the eve of the Civil War, the United States possessed more railroad mileage than all of Europe combined, a statistic that surprised Europeans and confirmed Americans in their sense that they were building something without precedent in the history of nations. The network was still incomplete, still uneven in its coverage, still technically imperfect in ways that would take decades to fully resolve. The gauges of different lines had not yet been standardized, which meant that freight moving between lines often had to be unloaded and reloaded, a wasteful and time-consuming process that the logic of the system was already working to eliminate. The bridges were sometimes inadequate for the loads they carried. The locomotives broke down at rates that modern engineers would find shocking. The management of the early railroads was improvised, their accounting practices primitive, their safety cultures essentially non-existent. But none of these imperfections negated the fundamental achievement, the tyranny of distance that had defined American life since the first European settlement of the continent had been broken, not ended. Distance would always be a factor, and geography would always exert its influence on human affairs, but broken in the sense that it could no longer set absolute limits on human possibility the way it once had. A man in Ohio with an idea and a product and the energy to pursue them was no longer imprisoned by the distance between himself and his market. A town with the right location could now grow to a size that its natural resources alone could never have supported. A nation that had been, despite all its ambitions, a loose collection of regional economies connected by slow and uncertain threads was becoming something more unified, more integrated, more genuinely national, the different parts of it pulling together in a common economy whose scale was beginning to suggest the scale of what America might eventually become. The locomotive that made this possible was a machine of the 19th century, burning coal or wood, driven by steam, maintained by men with oil cans and wrenches who understood it through intimacy rather than theory. It was loud and dirty and occasionally dangerous, and it was also, in its time and place, one of the most transformative devices that human ingenuity had ever produced. It did not just move things, it moved the future closer, collapsing the distance between what America was and what it was trying to become, pulling the sleepy inland towns and the fertile prairies and the distant mountains into a single vast connected enterprise, whose full implications would take generations to unfold, and that we are, in certain respects, still living inside. History has a preference for success. It likes the clean arc of the narrative that moves from problem to solution, from need to invention, from darkness to illuminated moment, and it tends to edit out the long, messy, failure-strewn middle sections, where most of the actual work gets done. The result is a version of technological history that is tidier and more heroic than the reality, populated by men of singular genius who saw clearly what others could not see and built what others could not build, and changed the world in ways that, in retrospect, seem almost inevitable. The reality of invention in early America was considerably less clean. It was characterized by false starts and dead ends, and bitter disputes over priority and credit, by men who were right about the important things, and catastrophically wrong about the details, by brilliant insights that arrive a decade before the materials and the manufacturing capability needed to realize them existed. by patent offices that moved slowly, and courts that moved expensively, and competitors who moved fast. It was, in short, a human enterprise, which is to say an enterprise conducted by people who were variously gifted and driven, and stubborn and unlucky, and occasionally prone to blowing themselves up in the course of their investigations. The inventors who populated the early American industrial landscape were not, for the most part, the formally educated men of science that a later generation would produce. The university-trained engineer, fluent in thermodynamics and material science, and the mathematics of structural analysis, was largely a creature of the second half of the 19th century. The men who built the first American machines worked from a different epistemological tradition, one rooted in craft knowledge and practical observation, and the particular confidence that comes from spending years with your hands inside mechanisms, learning how things work not from books but from the direct testimony of material reality. They were millwrights and blacksmiths and clockmakers and instrument makers, men whose formal education had often ended in childhood, but whose understanding of the physical world had continued to develop through decades of making and repairing and modifying things that other people needed to have work. John Fitch is a good place to begin, because Fitch's story contains in concentrated form nearly everything that characterized the experience of the early American inventor: the brilliant intuition, the grinding struggle for recognition and support, the near success followed by reversal, the bitterness of watching someone else receive credit for what you knew you had been first to achieve. Fitch was born in Connecticut in 1743 into a farm family of modest means, and his early life was a sequence of occupations that gave him broad practical knowledge without establishing him securely in any single trade. He worked as a brass founder and a silversmith and a clockmaker, and a surveyor, accumulating skills in each and settling into none, a pattern that suggested restlessness, and perhaps the particular difficulty that genuinely inventive minds often have in accepting the given shape of things when they can see so clearly how things might be shaped differently. His obsession with steam navigation began in the 1780s, when he was already in his 40s and had behind him a life that included a failed marriage, a period of captivity by Native Americans during his surveying work in Kentucky, and the general accumulated difficulty of a man who had always been trying to do more than his circumstances easily permitted. The idea of a steam-powered boat seized him with the completeness that true obsessions have, and he pursued it with a single-mindedness that was both his greatest strength and the quality that made him nearly impossible to work with. He petitioned state legislators for support. He demonstrated working models to men of influence. He built actual boats and ran them on the Delaware River in demonstrations that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that steam navigation was possible, and that he was the man who had made it so. His first successful steam-powered boat trial on the Delaware took place in 1787, more than 20 years before Robert Fulton's Clermont made its celebrated run up the Hudson. Fitch's boat moved under its own steam power in front of members of the Constitutional Convention, who happened to be in Philadelphia at the time, a circumstance that seems almost too perfectly symbolic to be coincidental. The men who were in the process of designing the future of American governance watched the future of American transportation move across the water before them, and they were interested but not interested enough to do anything about it, which was characteristic of the relationship between visionary inventors and practical men of affairs throughout this period, and indeed most periods. Fitch built more boats. He operated a steam-powered ferry service on the Delaware in the summer of 1790, carrying passengers between Philadelphia and Burlington, New Jersey, in what was by any reasonable definition a commercially operating steam-powered vessel nearly 2 decades before. Fulton, the service was not a financial success. Mechanical unreliability plagued the operation. The roads between the cities had improved enough that competing stage lines offered a viable alternative that passengers preferred when Fitch's boat was broken down, which was more often than the service could sustain. Investors who had been drawn in by the promise of the technology grew frustrated with the reality of its execution. Money dried up. Fitch moved to France, where he hoped to interest the revolutionary government in his ideas, found no more sympathy there than he had found in America, returned and died in Kentucky in 1798, having taken, according to the account preserved by those who knew him at the end, a carefully hoarded supply of opium pills to end a life that had given him everything, except the recognition and the success he had devoted it to pursuing. Fulton received the credit. History is full of such redistributations, where the man who arrives second with a better capitalized and better executed version of an idea receives the fame that the first man earned and died without. It is not entirely unjust. Execution matters, And the ability to take a working concept and turn it into a commercially viable operation is a real and valuable skill, but it is not entirely just either. And the men like E. Fitch, who disappear into the footnotes of the history that others headline, deserve to be remembered for what they were. The people who did the early work, who pushed through the initial resistance and established the proof of concept that made the later success possible. Oliver Evans, whom we have encountered before in his role as the prophet of high-pressure steam, deserves a fuller accounting here, because his career illuminates nearly every dimension of the early American inventor's experience. Evans was born in Delaware in 1755, the fifth of 12 children in a farming family. And like Fitch, he educated himself through work rather than school, apprenticing to a wheelwright and absorbing through that training a comprehensive practical understanding of mechanical systems that would serve as the foundation for everything he subsequently built. His mind was of the kind that cannot encounter a process without immediately analyzing it for inefficiency, cannot observe a system in operation without seeing how it might be improved, and this quality made him simultaneously a brilliant innovator and a difficult neighbor, because the same critical intelligence that identified problems in machines identified problems in human arrangements and expressed both with equal directness. His automated flour mill, completed in 1785, was genuinely revolutionary. The traditional grist mill required multiple workers to manage the movement of grain between the different stages of processing, from the hopper to the millstones to the bolting cloth that separated the flour from the bran, to the cooling floor to the storage bins. Evans replaced these workers with a system of mechanical conveyors, bucket elevators that lifted grain vertically, horizontal conveyors that moved it laterally, an Archimedean screw that fed it to the millstones, a device he called a hopper boy that spread the ground and meal on the cooling floor and raked it in slow circles until it was cool enough to bolt. The entire system was driven by the same water wheel that powered the millstones, requiring the attendance of only 1 or 2 workers to manage what had previously required 5 or 6. It was, in principle and in execution, a continuous production system of a kind that had not previously existed in American manufacturing. Evans patented his mill improvements and spent the next decade trying, with mixed success, to license them to mill operators across the mid-Atlantic states. The experience introduced him to the frustrations of patent enforcement in a legal system that was still developing its understanding of intellectual property. In a commercial culture that was not yet fully convinced that ideas required compensation in the way that physical labor did, mill owners used his innovations without paying him. When he sued, the legal proceedings were slow and expensive. When he won, the damages rarely covered the cost of litigation. He estimated, late in his life, that he had spent more on legal fees defending his patents than he had ever collected in licensing revenue, a calculation that many inventors of the period could have matched. His turn toward high-pressure steam, which occupied the second half of his career, brought him into conflict not just with infringers, but with the most respected engineering authority of the era. James Watt's reputation was such that his opinions about the dangerousness of high-pressure steam carried enormous weight, and Evans' insistence that high pressure was safe and superior when filtered through the lens of Watt's opposition sounded to many observers like the self-serving claim of an amateur contradicting an expert. Evans was not wrong. The history of steam technology would vindicate him completely, but being right in advance of the evidence is a lonely and unrewarding position, and he occupied it for years with a combativeness that made enemies he could not afford to make. His 1805 demonstration of the Oructor Amphibolos, the steam-powered dredging vehicle that moved through the streets of Philadelphia under its own power, was a genuine technological achievement that received a response, somewhere between puzzlement and derision, from contemporaries who were not yet equipped to understand what they were seeing. The vehicle was real, and it moved, and it was powered by a high-pressure steam engine of Evans's own design, but it was also ungainly and slow and served no immediately obvious commercial purpose, and the people who watched it lumber along Market Street were more amused than amazed. Evans understood what the Oructor represented in a way that his audience did not. It was a proof that a steam-powered vehicle could move on land, which meant that eventually steam-powered vehicles would move on land, which meant that everything about the geography and the commerce of a continent built on distance was eventually going to change. He was right by about 30 years, which in the life of an inventor is a painful margin. James Rumsey was another man who contested priority with Fitch over steam navigation, and whose claim had genuine merit, and whose fate was similarly disheartening. Rumsey was a Virginia innkeeper and mechanic, who had developed a steam-powered boat that used a jet propulsion system, pumping water in at the bow and expelling it at the stern, rather than the paddle mechanism that Fitch favored. He demonstrated his boat on the Potomac River in 1787, the same year as Fitch's Delaware demonstration, and secured the enthusiastic endorsement of George Washington, who had observed an earlier demonstration of Rumsey's mechanical ideas and was sufficiently impressed to write a testimonial that Rumsey carried with him as evidence of his credentials. The endorsement of Washington in 1787 was about as powerful a recommendation as the new republic could offer, and Rumsey used it to gain introductions and eventually funding for further development. He went to London in 1788 to continue his work and to seek backing from British investors, and died there in 1792, having just delivered a lecture to a scientific society that received a standing ovation, a moment of recognition that arrived too late to change the trajectory of his life in any practical way. His boat design was technically interesting, and his jet propulsion concept was not without merit, but it was less practically effective than the paddle alternatives, and it never achieved the commercial development that might have established his priority claims in the public mind. He is remembered now, when he is remembered at all, primarily in the context of the priority dispute with Fitch, two men arguing over credit for an achievement that would eventually be attributed to a third man who came after both of them. Jacob Perkins was a different kind of inventor from Fitch, or Evans, or Rumsey, less obsessive and more versatile, a man whose intelligence expressed itself across a remarkably wide range of problems, rather than concentrating itself with burning intensity on a single vision. Perkins was born in Massachusetts in 1766 and trained as a goldsmith, but his interests ranged promiscuously across the mechanical arts, and his career was a sequence of innovations in different fields that suggests a mind that was genuinely restless rather than strategically diversified. He developed improvements in the manufacture of cut nails that significantly reduced their cost and increased their availability, contributing materially to the building boom of the early republic. He invented a process for engraving steel plates that produced banknotes difficult to counterfeit, a contribution to financial security that the young nation's chaotic currency situation made practically urgent. He also worked on steam engines of the high-pressure variety, independently reaching conclusions similar to Evans's about the potential of steam at elevated pressures, and he built experimental steam-powered vehicles that ran on the streets of London, where he had moved in 1818 and where he would spend the rest of his life, finding in Britain a more receptive environment for his particular combination of practical genius and entrepreneurial ambition than America had provided. His refrigeration experiments, conducted in London in the 1820s and 1830s, produced a working vapor compression refrigeration machine that was decades ahead of any commercial application. The technology to make mechanical refrigeration practically useful would not arrive until after his death in 1849, but that established the physical principles on which all subsequent refrigeration technology would be built. He is one of those inventors whose work was so far ahead of its immediate context that it seems almost to belong to a different timeline. A man whose most important contributions were not recognized as such until long after he could take any satisfaction in the recognition. John Stevens, the New Jersey Railroad pioneer whose circular steam locomotive track in Hoboken we have already noted, came from a background entirely unlike the craft-trained mechanics who dominated early American invention. He was wealthy, educated at King's College in New York, a lawyer by training and a gentleman of affairs by inclination, and his interest in transportation technology was the interest of a man who understood the commercial and political implications of what he was seeing, rather than the interest of a man who needed to earn his living from what he built. This gave him a particular kind of vision, longer range, more systemic, more attentive to the infrastructure questions that the craft inventor typically left to others, and a particular kind of limitation, because the gentleman amateur, however intelligent, lacks the deep practical knowledge that comes from spending years making things with your hands. Stevens spent decades arguing for a national railroad system, at a time when the idea seemed fantastical to most of his contemporaries, writing pamphlets and petitioning legislatures and corresponding with anyone who would engage with his arguments. And he was right about the essentials in ways that would only become fully apparent a generation after he had been making the case. He was also, in his railroad experiments, practically limited by the engineering knowledge available to him. His small demonstration locomotive technically interesting, but mechanically crude in ways that the craft-trained engineers who built the serious early locomotives would not have permitted. The combination of his visionary understanding and his practical limitations made him a necessary but insufficient contributor to the railroad story. A man who helped create the intellectual and political space for the technology to develop without being the man who developed it. The explosions deserve their own accounting, because they were a real and regular feature of the early steam age, and because they illuminate something important about the nature of technological development in a period before systematic engineering knowledge existed to guide the design of high-pressure vessels. Steam boiler explosions were not rare accidents in early 19th century America. They were a recurring disaster, killing and maiming workers and passengers with a regularity that would be considered scandalous by any modern standard, and that was accepted, with varying degrees of resignation and outrage, as one of the costs of the technological progress the explosions were associated with. The cause of most explosions was straightforward in principle, though difficult to prevent in practice. A boiler that contained more steam pressure than its walls could contain would fail, and when it failed catastrophically. The stored energy of the compressed steam, releasing itself in an instant with a force that could destroy a vessel and kill everyone in its vicinity. The factors that contributed to dangerous overpressure were multiple and interacting. Poorly designed safety valves that failed to open when they should, or that were deliberately weighted down by engineers who found the constant escape of steam wasteful and who did not fully appreciate what they were trading for the saved fuel. Boiler plates that were thinner or weaker than the design required, either because of manufacturing imperfection or because the manufacturer had substituted inferior material without telling anyone. Water levels that dropped too low, leaving sections of the boiler wall unsupported by the cooling effect of the water and subject to catastrophic weakening. The inventors who worked with high-pressure steam were aware of these risks, and the more responsible among them took them seriously. Evans was genuinely careful in his own designs, and his advocacy for high-pressure steam was always accompanied by advocacy for proper engineering and proper safety devices, a nuance that got lost in the public debate, where his position was often characterized as reckless. But awareness of risk and ability to eliminate it were different things in a period when the metallurgy of boilerplate was poorly understood, when the testing of pressure vessels was not systematic, and when the economic pressure to run engines hard and push pressures higher was constant and difficult to resist. Samuel Morey is another figure who deserves retrieval from the footnotes. A Vermont inventor who built a steam-powered boat that he demonstrated on the Connecticut River in 1793, before either Fitch had given up or Fulton had begun, and who also conducted experiments in the 1820s with an internal combustion engine that used a mixture of vaporized spirits and air as its working fluid. Morey's internal combustion engine was real, and it ran and it produced mechanical work from a chemical reaction, rather than from steam, which put him on a conceptual track that would eventually lead to the gasoline engine and the automobile, though the practical realization of that track was still decades away and depended on developments in chemistry and material science that Morey could not access. He patented his vapor engine in 1826 and received for it approximately the attention that early American inventors characteristically received for ideas that were ahead of their time, which is to say very little. What these men shared, across the differences of background and temperament and specific obsession, was a relationship to failure that was not the relationship of ordinary experience. Ordinary experience teaches that failure is a signal to stop, that the persistent recurrence of difficulty is evidence that you are pursuing the wrong path. The inventors of early America had, by some combination of temperament and circumstance, been equipped with a different relationship to failure, one that read it not as a signal to stop, but as information about what to try next, as a narrowing of the possibility space that brought the working solution closer, even as it demonstrated that the current approach was wrong. This relationship to failure is easier to describe than to sustain, because failure is painful and expensive and socially costly in ways that abstract descriptions do not capture, and the men who maintained it through years of disappointment and financial difficulty and public skepticism were doing something that required not just intelligence but a particular kind of will. They were also, it is worth saying, sustained by something that the history of invention tends to underweight: the pleasure of the work itself. The ledgers of failure and frustration that dominate the biographical record of these men are real, but they exist alongside something else, something visible in the letters and journals where the formal mask of the practical petition writer drops away. and the actual emotional texture of the inventive life appears. There is pleasure in making things work, a pleasure that is immediate and physical and not dependent on commercial success or public recognition. There is pleasure in understanding how something works, in the moment when a mechanism that has been producing unexpected results suddenly reveals the reason for its behavior, and you see, with the clarity that genuine understanding brings, exactly what has been going wrong and exactly what to do about it. These pleasures sustain the tinkerers and the accidental geniuses through the long middle sections of their careers, where the commercial and biographical record shows only struggle. The accidental part of accidental genius is worth taking seriously too, because the randomness of discovery in this period was real and consequential. The conditions did not exist for systematic research programs of the kind that would eventually produce industrial laboratories and organized development projects. Knowledge advanced through the unpredictable encounters between curious minds and unexpected results. Through the experiment that failed in an interesting way. Through the observation made by someone who happened to be present at the right moment and had the apparition to understand what they were seeing. Charles Goodyear's vulcanization of rubber, which happened when he accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur on a hot stove and noticed that the result was tough and elastic in the way that natural rubber was not, is only the most famous of these accidental discoveries. The early industrial period was full of them, knowledge accreting through a process that was neither systematic nor entirely random, but something between the two, shaped by intention, without being determined by it. The men who populated this process were not the solitary geniuses of the heroic narrative. They knew each other, corresponded with each other, read each other's patents and pamphlets, built on each other's failures as much as on each other's successes. Fitch knew of Rumsey's work and disputed his claims in documents that also acknowledged what Rumsey had established. Evans read everything he could find about British steam practice and corresponded with anyone who would engage with his ideas. The early American scientific and technical community was small enough that its members were connected, directly or through a few intermediaries, across the distances that geography imposed, and the knowledge they generated circulated through those connections in ways that made each individual contribution part of a larger collective project, even when the individuals were competing bitterly for priority and credit. That collective project was the mechanization of a continent, the translation of natural resources and human energy into industrial output at a scale that the world had not previously seen. The inventors who contributed to it were neither heroes nor victims, though they experienced moments of both. They were people who had found the thing that their particular combination of intelligence and obsession and circumstance equipped them to pursue, and who pursued it with the commitment that such a finding demands. The failures are part of the record. The explosions are part of the record. The bitter patent disputes and the priority arguments and the deaths in obscurity are all part of the record. But so is the work itself, the actual making and testing and revising. The hours in the workshop when the problem was the only thing, and the solution felt, if not close, at least possible. That is where the history actually happened, in those hours, and it is worth trying to see it there, in the specific and unrepeatable texture of people doing difficult things because the doing of them was what they were for. Every age that builds something large builds it on foundations that it prefers not to examine too closely. The early American Industrial Revolution built its mills and its furnaces and its railroads and its continental market on foundations that included, alongside the water power and the anthracite coal, and the mechanical ingenuity and the entrepreneurial ambition, the labor of children, the deaths of workers in fires and explosions, and the slow attrition of industrial disease, the dismantling of craft traditions that had given meaning and dignity to working life for generations, and the systematic suppression of the organizing impulse that arose, inevitably and repeatedly, among the people who understood most clearly what was being asked of them and what they were receiving in return. These are not incidental features of the early industrial story. They are structural ones, woven into the fabric of the achievement as completely as the machinery itself, inseparable from the output and the profit and the national prosperity that the period generated. And they deserve to be seen clearly, without the softening that distance and prosperity tend to apply to historical suffering. The children came first, in time, if not always in the consciousness of the people who employed them. Samuel Slater's first mill at Pawtucket, the foundational establishment of American textile manufacturing, was staffed almost entirely by children. This was not an accident or a temporary expedient. It was a deliberate choice, modeled directly on the British practice that Slater had learned in the mills of Derbyshire. where child labor was not merely accepted but theorized, justified by a body of economic and moral argument that presented the employment of children as a benefit to them and to their families, and to society at large. Children's fingers were small and nimble, suited to piecing broken threads and reaching into the narrow spaces of the machinery to clear blockages. Children were cheap, earning a fraction of the adult wage for work that required comparable attention if not comparable strength. Children were, it was argued, with a circularity that those who benefited from it found perfectly convincing, better off working than idle, better occupied in the mill than running loose in circumstances that would form bad habits and lead to worse outcomes. The children who entered Slater's mill, and the mills that followed its model, were as young as 7. 7 is an age at which children in the early 21st century are in 2nd grade, learning to read with confidence and multiply small numbers and understand something about the world they inhabit through the protected medium of supervised education. The 7-year-olds of early American textile manufacturing were standing in front of spinning frames for 12 to 14 hours a day, walking the length of the machines and back, watching for broken threads and air thick with cotton lint, in rooms where the noise made conversation impossible and the temperature was maintained at levels that the machinery required, rather than levels that human beings preferred. They did this 6 days a week, every week, in a routine without vacation or respite beyond the occasional illness that removed them temporarily from the work, and that was itself shaped by the work, because the respiratory ailments that plagued mill workers of all ages were particularly devastating in the lungs of children, whose immune systems were still developing. The families who sent their children to the mills were not, in most cases, indifferent to their welfare. They were poor. The distinction is important, because the easy condemnation of parents who allowed their children to be employed in conditions we now recognize as harmful requires ignoring the economic reality that those parents inhabited, a reality in which the margin between subsistence and destitution was narrow enough that the earnings of a child could make the difference between a family that ate adequately and a family that did not. The mill owners understood this reality and exploited it with the systematic thoroughness that the market logic of their enterprise encouraged. Because every reduction in the cost of labor was a reduction in the cost of production and an improvement in the margin that made the enterprise viable and growing. The suffering of the children was not the goal. It was the byproduct of a system optimized for something else, which made it, in some ways, harder to address than suffering that was intentional. Because at least intentional cruelty has a human agent who can be confronted and blamed and punished. The Rhode Island system, as Slater's model came to be known, employed whole families, which gave it a superficial appearance of social coherence that obscured the exploitation at its center. Father, mother, and children all worked in the mill, their wages pooled into a family income that was nominally higher than what any individual member could earn, but that was achieved at the cost of every member's labor and every member's health. The company housing that the mill provided, the company store where the family purchased its necessities, the company church where it worshipped. All of these created a web of dependency that made the theoretical freedom of the wage relationship feel, in practice, considerably less free than the theory suggested. A family that owed rent to the company and carried a balance at the company store was not in a strong position to respond to a wage reduction by finding work elsewhere. And the mill owners understood this as well as the families did. The fire was always present as a possibility, and periodically it became a reality. The early American mill was a structure that combined in a single building most of the elements needed for a catastrophic fire. Wooden floors and wooden structural members impregnated with decades of machine oil, open flames from the oil lamps and later the gas fixtures that provided the lighting. That natural light could not, the fine airborne particles of cotton or wool fiber that settled on every surface and that could ignite with a speed and completeness that surprised even people who understood the theoretical danger, and machinery that generated friction heat and occasional sparks as a normal consequence of its operation. The mill was not merely fire-prone. It was, in its basic physical constitution, a fire waiting for an occasion. The occasions came regularly enough that the historical record of early American textile manufacturing is punctuated by accounts of mill fires that destroyed buildings and, with varying frequency, killed the people inside them. The fires that occurred during working hours presented particular dangers because the buildings were deep and the exits were few, and the stairs were narrow, and the noise of the machinery meant that an alarm race at one end of a building might not be heard at the other end until the fire had already cut off the escape routes that the workers in the far section would have needed. The locked doors that mill management sometimes maintained, to prevent workers from leaving the premises during working hours and to control access to the machinery and materials, became death traps when fire moved faster than the time required to find a supervisor with a key. The Pemberton Mill collapse in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1860, though technically a structural failure rather than a fire, illustrates the catastrophic potential of early industrial buildings with a vividness that makes it impossible to look away. The Pemberton was a large textile mill, 5 stories of brick construction housing hundreds of workers, and it collapsed without warning on a January afternoon, the walls and floors pancaking downward in a cascade of structural failure that buried workers under tons of debris. Those who survived the initial collapse were then threatened by fire from the overturned gas fixtures and oil lamps that ignited in the rubble, and the combination of crushing debris and flames produced a death toll of nearly 150 people, with hundreds more injured. In a single afternoon, the Pemberton disaster shocked the country in a way that the gradual attrition of industrial disease and the smaller fires that preceded it had not. Perhaps because its suddenness and completeness made it impossible to attribute to the carelessness or misfortune of individual workers in the way that other industrial accidents were routinely explained away. The erosion of craft tradition was a slower catastrophe than fire, less dramatic in any individual moment, but more consequential in aggregate, because what it destroyed was not just livelihoods, but the entire framework of meaning within which skilled workers had understood this place in the world. The craft tradition was not merely a way of making things, it was a way of being in the world, a set of relationships and identities and sources of dignity that organized a working person's experience of themselves and their community. The shoemaker who had spent years learning his craft, who could look at a piece of leather and understand its qualities and limitations, who could produce from it a shoe fitted to a specific foot with a precision that no machine could match, was not simply someone who made shoes. He was a craftsman, and the word carried a weight of social meaning that encompassed his relationship to his materials, his relationship to his customers, his position in his community, his understanding of his own worth. The machine did not destroy this overnight. The transition from craft production to industrial production in most trades was a process that extended over decades, during which craft workers and factory workers existed in uneasy competition, the factory's price advantage eroding the craft market gradually, rather than all at once, giving the craftsman time to understand what was happening, but not enough time to prevent it. The shoemakers of Massachusetts watched the development of shoe manufacturing machinery in the 1840s and 1850s, with an anxiety that expressed itself in labor organization and political agitation, and the kind of furious, public argument that people make when they understand that the thing being argued about is not merely economic but existential. They were right. The mechanization of shoe manufacturing did not just reduce their wages, it made their skills irrelevant, which meant it made their identities irrelevant, which is a form of harm that economic analysis is poorly equipped to measure, but that those who experience it feel with complete clarity. The hand-loom weavers who were displaced by the power low, the hand spinners who were displaced by the spinning frame, the skilled iron puddlers whose labor-intensive method of producing wrought iron was eventually rendered obsolete by the Bessemer converter. All of these groups experienced versions of the same displacement, the painful discovery that a skill which had taken years to acquire and which had been the foundation of a life could be made worthless in the time it took a new machine to be installed and a new, cheaper, less skilled worker to be trained to tend it. The language in which these workers described their situation was not the language of economic analysis. It was the language of loss and betrayal, of something taken that had not been offered for taking, and it carried an emotional charge that no accounting of productivity gains or falling consumer prices could adequately address. The labor movement that began to form in this context was not a unified thing with a clear program and a recognized leadership. It was a dispersed and often contradictory set of impulses, organizing efforts, and political interventions that emerged from different trades in different cities, and different philosophical traditions, and that agreed on very little except that the current arrangement was unjust, and that workers had interests that the current arrangement was not serving. The early labor movement in America drew on multiple intellectual traditions simultaneously. The Republican ideology of the founding era, which provided a language of rights and citizenship that workers could deploy in their own cause, the evangelical Protestant tradition, which provided a language of moral accountability that could be applied to the behavior of employers as readily as to the behavior of workers, and the emerging tradition of labor radicalism that was developing in Britain and Europe, and that arrived in America in the minds of immigrant workers who had been exposed to more systematic critiques of the industrial order than most American workers had encountered. The Working Men's Party, which emerged in Philadelphia in 1828 and spread to other cities in the early 1830s, was one of the first organized political expressions of working-class interests in American history, and its platform reveals the range of concerns that the early labor movement encompassed. It demanded the 10-hour workday, a reduction from the 12 and 14 hours that were then standard that would have seemed modest to later labor activists. But that was in the context of 1828, a radical demand. It demanded the abolition of imprisonment for debt, an institution that bore with particular cruelty on working people whose thin financial margins made them perpetually vulnerable to the spiral of debt and legal consequence that a single bad season or a single illness could initiate. It demanded free public education, understanding that the concentration of educational advantage in the children of the prosperous was not merely an inequality of opportunity, but a mechanism for reproducing class structure across generations. These were not narrow trade demands. They were a comprehensive vision of a different social arrangement, one in which the dignity and the interests of working people were taken seriously as political facts, rather than economic externalities. The 10-hour movement, which became one of the central organizing causes of the 1830s and 1840s, illustrates the difficulty of labor organizing in this period with painful clarity. The demand was modest by any humane standard. 10 hours of industrial labor per day is still an exhausting and physically demanding schedule by modern expectations, still a schedule that leaves very little time for the rest and the family life and the civic participation that a democracy requires of its citizens. But the opposition it encountered was fierce and sustained, rooted in a combination of economic interest and ideological conviction that proved extremely difficult to overcome. Mill owners argued that the 10-hour day would make American manufacturing uncompetitive with British industry, which operated on longer hours. They argued that workers who wanted shorter hours were welcome to seek employment elsewhere, invoking the freedom of contract in a context where the freedom was considerably more meaningful to one party than to the other. They argued, with a paternalism that the workers who heard it found infuriating, that long working hours protected workers from the idleness and the vice that shorter hours would invite. The strikes and the turnouts and the labor actions that punctuated this period were met with responses that ranged from simple replacement of the striking workers with others desperate enough to accept the existing terms, to the blacklisting of organizers, to the invocation of conspiracy laws that in some states made collective labor action a criminal offense. The legal framework within which labor organizing took place was deeply hostile to it, reflecting a set of assumptions about the relationship between employer and employee that had been developed in an era of craft production and that had not caught up with the realities of industrial employment. A worker who entered into an individual contract with an employer was, in the legal theory of the period, a free agent exercising his rights. Workers who acted collectively to improve their terms were, in the same legal theory, a conspiracy and restraint of trade, using collective power to interfere with the employer's freedom to set conditions. The asymmetry of power that made collective action necessary was invisible to a legal framework that saw only the formal equality of contracting righties. The children's voices are the hardest to hear in this history, because children do not leave the documentary record that adults leave. They do not write petitions or deliver speeches or publish pamphlets, and the accounts of their working lives that do survive come almost entirely from adults observing them, adults who had various reasons to represent what they saw in particular ways. The mill owners and their apologists described contented children engaged in healthy activities suited to their capacities. The reformers and the labor advocates described suffering children whose development was being stunted by labor that no child should be asked to perform. Both descriptions were shaped by the purposes they served, and the truth, as usual, was somewhere in between, and more complicated than either. What is clear from the physical evidence? The heights and weights and skeletal remains of mill workers, the records of industrial disease, the testimony of physicians who treated working people in mill towns, is that industrial child labor imposed real and measurable costs on the bodies of the children who performed it. Growth was stunted. Respiratory disease was common and early. The accidents that took fingers and hands from adult workers took them from child workers too. with the additional cruelty that a child's lifetime of limitation stretched further into the future than an adult's. The children who worked the mills were not destroyed by it in most cases. Human resilience is remarkable, and the majority of them survived to adulthood and formed families and lived lives that left no trace in the historical record. But they were diminished by it in ways that they could not have articulated, and that those who employed them preferred not to examine. The reformers who eventually succeeded in restricting child labor in American industry did so through a combination of moral argument, legislative action, and the gradual development of compulsory education laws that created an alternative institutional claim on children's time that competed with the factory's claim. The process was slow and uneven, advancing in some states and stalling in others, repeatedly compromised by exemptions and loopholes that preserved the most egregious practices while appearing to address them. Massachusetts passed the first meaningful child labor law in 1836, requiring that children under 15 who worked in manufacturing attend school for at least 3 months of the year, a requirement that was easy to evade and frequently evaded, but that established the principle that the state had an interest in the development of its youngest citizens that could override the economic interests of their employers. The principle, once established, grew slowly toward the comprehensive protection of children that the early reformers had envisioned. But it grew over decades rather than years, and in the meantime the mills continued to run, and the children continued to tend them, their small figures moving through the roaring workrooms in the morning dark, doing the work that the industrial economy required, and receiving for it the wages that their families needed and the damage that no accounting system of the period bothered to record. The human cost that no one counted was counted anyway, in the end, by the bodies that bore it and the communities that struggled to sustain themselves inside the contradictions of an economic revolution that created wealth and distributed its benefits and its burdens with a thoroughness and an inequity that would take generations to fully understand and longer still to begin to address. The shadow side of the iron dream was not separate from the dream. It was cast by it, inseparable from the light that made it visible, present in every yard of cloth and every ton of iron and every mile of rail that the early American Industrial Revolution produced. To see the achievement clearly is to see the shadow too, not as a reason to diminish what was built, but as a reason to understand completely what building it required, and what it cost, and who paid. The workers who paid those costs were not footnotes in the story of American industrialization. They were the story, the human fact without which the machinery was nothing, the irreducible presence at the center of every mill and every furnace, and every railroad gang that transformed a continental wilderness into the most productive industrial economy the world had yet seen. They deserve to be seen there, in the heat and the noise and the long hours of the working day, doing what they did, at the cost that it cost them, in the knowledge that the history that remembers the achievement owes at least as much to the accounting of that cost.